Hello, sleepyheads. Welcome in. Before we start tonight's tale, tell me in the chat, where are you watching from and what's the weather like there? Rain on your windows? Crickets outside? Snow doing its quiet magic? Grab a blanket, pour something warm, dim the lights and let your shoulders drop. This is a cozy corner of history. Soft voice, slow pace, big mug energy. Tonight's story is called Last at the Table, Why Children Ate After Everyone Else. We'll drift through small kitchens and smoky hearths, village greens and great halls, and we'll peek at the strange math families used when food ran thin. You'll meet the hungry gap, that worried season between the last turnip and the first new greens. You'll hear how households lined up bowls by strength, status and work, how fathers and field hands were served first, mothers measured portions like delicate arithmetic, and children waited, learning patience the hard way. We'll talk about thin pottage and thick crusts, about feast days that weren't always feasts for little bellies, and about the tiny strategies kids learned, herb picking, pot scraping, timing the ladle, to turn scarcity into something survivable. We'll wander upstairs to noble tables, so much silver, so few seats for the small, then back down to kitchen doors where scraps meant everything. We'll touch on remedies and rules, and on the quiet tenderness that still flickered. A saved heel of bread, a warm cup of broth, a hand smoothing a child's hair. Settle in, breathe slow, let the day go. Tell me your location and weather, then tuck your feet under the blanket. When you're ready, we'll open the old wooden door and step into the kitchen firelight, where the bowls are lined up, the steam rises, and the story begins. In pre-industrial Europe, the season most likely to strain a family's food supply was not deep winter, but late winter into early spring, the hungry gap. By February and March, often stretching into April or May, depending on latitude and weather, the food gathered after the previous harvest had been steadily eaten for 5 or 6 months. What remained in bins, barrels and clamps was the tired end of the stores, grain with more dust than kernels, onions softening, salted meat growing stringy and harsh, and dried peas that took longer to cook and never fully softened. The problem was not only quantity but timing. Fields had not yet produced the new season's vegetables or cereals, yet the household needed strength for the heaviest work of the year, ploughing, manuring, ditching and repairing buildings after winter damage. Grain was the backbone of calories, but spring turned grain into an accounting problem. Families needed flour for bread now, but they also needed seed for sowing. Seed grain had to be protected from the cookpot at all costs. A prudent householder physically separated sacks meant for seed. Some even stored it at a neighbour's or under a church warden's oversight, so it would not be borrowed in a lean week. The bread that did appear on the table in March was often coarser and thinner. Millers and bakers coped with inferior grain by sifting less, mixing species rye with barley, oats with wheat, and extending dough with peas, beans or bran. The result filled stomachs but delivered fewer calories and sometimes more digestive trouble. Vegetable stores also reached their limits. In strictly medieval contexts, root crops included turnips, parsnips, carrots, often pale rather than orange, beets and cabbages kept in pits or sheds. In some regions, leeks overwintered in the ground. By spring, many roots became woody or sprouted, and cabbages split or rotted. In later early modern settings where potatoes had become a staple, sprouting potatoes created a similar spring headache. Tubers shrank and greened, losing food value and sometimes developing bitter, unsafe parts. Whether the staple was medieval roots or later potatoes, the logic was the same. Stores were aging just as appetites for fieldwork were rising. Animal products offered little rescue. Cows freshened with spring grass, but late winter was the low point for milk. Hens laid poorly until daylight lengthened. In many households, eggs were rare before April. Salted pork or beef from the autumn slaughter was still available, but more brine than meat by March, and fuel for long boiling was itself precious. Ale, the everyday drink, might be weak if malt ran short or colder mashings failed, and hops, where used from last year, lost pungency. In towns, supply chains eased some pressure. Bakers could buy grain, and markets moved fish and cheese, but prices climbed in the hungry gap, and poorer families were outbid. The calendar made matters worse. Church fasts in Lent reduced animal fat and meat consumption just as calories were scarcest. Wealthy households managed Lenten tables with fish, almond milk, and quality bread. Poorer families experienced it as thin soups with a little oil or none at all. Charity existed, alms loaves, parish doles, but these were irregular and rarely matched need. In some places, municipal rules tried to moderate price spikes. In practice, scarcity still favoured those with cash. Work patterns sharpened the inequality inside the home. The logic of feed the worker first led many households to serve the largest portions to adults who ploughed or carted. Mothers acted as rationers, stretching pots of pottage, cereal plus vegetables, sometimes a shred of meat, so that everyone received something, if not enough. Children were often served last and learned to value crusts and the browned scrapings from the pan. This hierarchy did not necessarily reflect indifference. It reflected a calculation that the family's survival depended on the strongest stomachs getting the fuel to bring in the next harvest. But the effect on small bodies, stunting, more frequent illness and listlessness, was real. Coping strategies were practical and unromantic. Foraging began as soon as shoots appeared. Nettles, goosefoot, sorrel, wild garlic, and young dandelion greens went into pots to bulk out grain. Bakers extended dough. Cooks lengthened stews with water and long simmering. Families swapped or bartered, a little firewood for a scoop of peas, a day's mending for a jug of last year's cider. Famine foods, acorns, inferior grains, or faded dried fruit, appeared in the worst years. None of this solved the hungry gap, it only dulled its edge. Finally, storage itself fought back. Rats, damp and mould increased losses the longer food sat. Rye risked ergot in bad years. Oats absorbed moisture, barrels dried and leaked. The same clamp that preserved turnips in October might sweat and spoil them by March. Even in households that planned well, the margin narrowed with each week of cold weather and short days. This is why spring, not winter, was the danger zone. The family stood between dwindling reserves and not yet arrived harvests, compelled to work harder on fewer calories. Understanding this seasonal squeeze explains many behaviours that look harsh from a modern viewpoint. Strict portioning, feeding workers first, and children waiting at the end of the line. In the next chapter, we'll follow a meal from kitchen to table and watch the pecking order play out in real time. When food stores tightened in the hungry gap, the household economy shifted to bread-first accounting. Bread was not simply one item on the table, it was the framework for every other decision. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, grain supplied the majority of calories, so families measured work, wages and favours in terms of loaves and the flour needed to make them. The logic that fed workers first translated into a strict, almost clerical system for portioning and protecting bread from February through spring. In rural homes, the bake was typically weekly. Grain was ground at the manor mill or a rented quern. Flour was sifted lightly to avoid waste, then mixed with yesterday's leaven. Women managed a predictable cycle: soak, knead, prove near the hearth, bake in a shared oven or on a hearthstone. The size and number of loaves were set before mixing, an intentional way to stop portions from creeping larger during a lean week. Families favoured dense maslin, wheat rye or rye loaves that kept longer and resisted mould. Barley and oat cakes filled gaps but staled quickly. They were eaten first while the big loaves were held back. Urban families relied more on the market. Municipal assize of bread and ale, regulations linked loaf weight to grain price to prevent profiteering. In practice, poor buyers still felt the pinch. As grain deared, the legal loaf shrank. Bakers marked loaves with stamps to identify their shop. Households learned which stamps meant honest weight and which meant a loaf that would dry out by morning. Bread became the largest cash outlay for many wage earners, so shoppers bought early to avoid end-of-day leftovers and sometimes split a loaf across 2 days, supplementing with pottage. Inside the home, bread moved under guard. Many households kept a bread chest with a hasp. The key stayed with the housewife. Slices were cut against a rule of thumb, literally. Some used a notched board, others a marked knife or trenchers scored with lines. Children's pieces were smaller by custom, and scrape rights, the browned bottom from the bake or the crust from the pot, were informally assigned to the last served. In tight weeks, a family might designate a single cutting hour to discourage nibbling. Bread was eaten with pottage to slow consumption. A bite of loaf, then spoonfuls of hot liquid, which filled the stomach more cheaply than extra bread. Seed grain discipline bled into bread discipline. Flour for baking and grain for sowing were stored apart so that a bad evening could not end with tomorrow's field in the oven. Where possible, households converted a little grain into coin early in winter to buy salt, oil and fuel. By late winter, the conversion ran the other way. Small goods bartered for a measure of meal. Neighbours lent and borrowed in measures rather than coins, tracked with tally sticks or knotted cords. A notch for a ladle of meal today meant a notch returned after Easter. Quality fell as spring approached. Flour contained more bran. Bakers extended dough with peas or beans. Families tolerated unpleasant textures because bulk mattered. Cheaper loaves also spoiled faster. Damp cellars and warm hearths both encouraged mould. The safest spot was cool and dry, but few cottages offered ideal storage. To avoid spoilage, households cut the weekly bake to a smaller batch and filled the gap with oatcakes, pea breads or spoon bread, soft dough cooked as dumplings in the pot. Every adjustment aimed at the same target: keep bread on the table every day, even if thinner. The budgeting extended to the table hierarchy. Workers' slices were cut first and sometimes set aside before anyone sat down. Children were told to wait for the end crusts, a phrase that signalled both fairness and finality. On Sundays or feast eves, the rule might relax: an extra finger width of bread, a bit of honey. Yet the baseline remained discipline. If a father or elder son had to travel for labour, his ration was wrapped in cloth and sent with him. The household adjusted downward accordingly. Bread was portable calories, and portability reinforced hierarchy. Those who laboured away from home received a share first because their absence would otherwise be an excuse to reduce their portion. Markets, parishes and manors all played secondary roles in this bread arithmetic. Towns posted assize tables, beadles checked weights, offenders paid fines or endured the assize loaf public shaming. Parishes distributed small alms loaves during Lent, but recipients might still divide each charity loaf into measured rations for several days. On some estates, lords issued issue bread to servants or day labourers. Even then, household bread had to stretch to cover non-working mouths. In famine years, authorities sometimes forbade baking fine white loaves to reserve good flour for soldiers or hospitals, pushing families toward coarse breads regardless of preference. Fuel scarcity quietly shaped bread budgeting too. Long bakes used precious wood. Many villages coordinated communal oven days to concentrate fuel use. Miss the slot, miss your bread. That risk drove meticulous planning of dough quantity and timing. A failed rise could mean a week of crumbs. To reduce risk, households carried on starters in earthen pots and guarded them as carefully as the key to the chest. None of this implies parents were indifferent to children's hunger. It shows how a calorie-critical economy forced choices that favoured immediate productivity and seed security over equal portions. Bread was a ledger. Every slice recorded a calculation about survival to the next harvest. From the bread chest to the table, households turned slices into strategy. If a loaf was a ledger, the first entries went to those whose labour supposedly protected tomorrow's entries, adult workers. The rule looked simple: the ploughman before the pot scraper, the carter before the child. Underneath sat a tight web of assumptions about calories, productivity, and risk that many families accepted as common sense in the hungry gap. First, the arithmetic of heavy work. Spring demanded the year's highest energy outlay: turning soil, hauling manure, repairing hedges, driving livestock to pasture, patching roofs and carts after winter rot. Heads of household framed bread as fuel for that day's irreplaceable tasks. Missing a plough day because a worker fainted or slowed down meant losing the soil's ideal moisture window. A week's delay could reduce yields for months. In that calculus, an extra finger width of bread to a strong adult promised a higher return than the same slice to a 5-year-old. Second, the protection of seed and stock. Families believed the best way to defend the seed bin and the animals was to keep the strongest hands strong. If the sower faltered, seed was wasted. If the herdsman missed the timing of pasture shifts, milk and lambs suffered. Feeding workers first looked like protecting capital. It was also insurance against wage loss. A day labourer who arrived weak might be turned away from hiring places, jeopardising cash used for salt, oil, or a mill fee. Third, portioning followed status and life stage. Many households ranked mouths by a mix of role and age. Adult male worker, adult female worker, adolescent worker, younger children, toddlers. Women doing fieldwork or heavy domestic production, spinning quotas, brewing, laundry, could and did receive larger shares, but domestic ideology often masked their labour, classing it as lighter, and therefore rationing them closer to children than to men. Apprentices and servants, though technically youths, usually ate ahead of resident children because their labour was contracted, their absence costly, and their rations specified in agreements. A master who shorted an apprentice risked desertion, fines, or a ruined season. Fourth, institutions echoed the same logic, reinforcing it in households. Manorial issue bread, monastic refectory scales, and urban craft ordinances often tied ration sizes to work categories. Hospital accounts listed workers' loaves, distinct from paupers' loaves. Lenten alms sometimes specified recipients fit for labour. Families absorbed those public hierarchies and reproduced them at home. Sermons and moral handbooks praised diligence and thrift, casting generous children's portions as indulgence but full workers' plates as prudence. Fifth, the rule was easy to administer, cutting the big slices first, wrapping a travel ration, reserving the browned bottom for the late-returning carter. These habits standardised the day. Regularity discouraged nibbling, simplified disputes and minimised waste. Children waiting their turn became part of the household training programme. Patience, quiet at table, no snatching. In a system where every crumb counted, predictability was a management tool. Yet the logic was flawed on several fronts. Biologically, children are growing organisms. Underfeeding them in repeated hungry gaps compounded stunting and illness, breeding long-term weakness in the very labour force households wanted to secure. Epidemiologically, underfed children succumbed to spring fevers and gut complaints faster, increasing care burdens for mothers and sisters and draining work capacity elsewhere. Even in productivity terms, the marginal loaf to a half-starved child sometimes yielded more total household stability, fewer crises, less lost time, than boosting an already adequate little portion. The rule also ignored the hidden labour that kept the system running: water drawing, tinder gathering, minding infants, gleaning greens, tending poultry, spinning in quotas demanded by clothiers. Those tasks were frequently done by women and children, yet their caloric claims were discounted as light. Where household task lists were written, estate instructions, service contracts, the invisibility of these chores hardened into policy, cementing smaller rations. Not every table was rigid. Most families bent the rule for illness, feast eves, or exceptional toil by a child, lambing nights, planting spurts. Many mothers slipped crumb equity into the day, a heel saved for a youngest, a ladle of extra pottage for an anemic daughter, a posset for a coughing boy. Parish charity sometimes targeted children. Godparents and neighbours offered bites from their own loaves. In towns, snack economies, crusts from bakers, spoonfuls from cookshops, softened edges for the smallest. Still, these were patches, not policy. Market shocks exposed the rule's brittleness. When prices spiked in late winter, bought bread shrank by law, and in practice, overbaking stale stock. Families had less to allocate, yet spring work could not be paused. The temptation to cannibalise seed grain rose. To prevent disaster, households redoubled the workers' first rule, pushing children's portions lower still. In that spiral, short-term logic clashed with long-term viability. Finally, authority within the household mattered. Where the rationing key stayed with the housewife and her judgment carried weight, evidence suggests more nuanced allocation, more broths, more small feedings for children between cutting hours, more attention to who had been sick. Where patriarchal command was sharper, slices tracked rank more than need. Either way, the practice encoded a belief. Survival flowed from feeding strength, not from protecting vulnerability. Understanding this mindset clarifies why children so often stood at the end of the line despite obvious harm. The hungry gap forced families to make decisions under scarcity and uncertainty. They chose what seemed safest for the next day's labour, even when it undermined the next generation's resilience. In the chapter that follows, we move from principle to practice and watch a meal's choreography. Who cuts, who carries, who speaks, and how a child learns the rhythms of eating last. At the day's main meal in a peasant household, Priority usually followed the same hierarchy that governed work. The people who moved soil, hauled loads, and handled animals were served first and heaviest. This was not framed as favouritism. It was presented as insurance. In a subsistence economy, energy spent had to return as harvest later. The belief, rarely written down but widely practised, was that each extra mouthful given to the strongest worker was a small deposit toward next season's grain. The timetable of the farming year amplified this logic. Spring ploughing and harrowing, summer haymaking and autumn reaping demanded continuous heavy exertion. Missing the right weather window because a ploughman tired early could shift yields for a whole strip. Households therefore cut the first slices for the primary field hands, often the husband, an adult son, and any hired man or bonded servant, before turning to others. If a household took in a temporary labourer for ditching or carting, his ration was explicitly larger. Agreements for service frequently specified bread weight or meat days, signalling that calories were part of wages. The foods themselves tracked this policy. The thickest part of the pottage, richer in grain and fat, went to the workers' trenchers. Salt pork or a cheese portion, scarcer and higher value, was divided toward those who would be in the fields. Ale was ladled with similar bias. Stronger ale, which delivered more calories per cup, went to the men heading out. The watered remainder was left for children and the elderly. None of this required account books at the cottage level. It relied on custom and the authority of the person guarding the bread chest and ladle. Status and muscle were not identical, but they overlapped. Women who scythed, carted dung, or gleaned heavily could receive working shares on busy days, yet domestic ideology often coded their labour as secondary. Adolescent boys who could keep pace with men at hay or harvest moved up the ration ladder. Younger children remained at the end. Even when the day's chores, herding geese, hauling water, spinning, were continuous. Servants and apprentices, though not kin, commonly ate before household children because their contracts bound the master to feed them adequately. Underfeeding a servant threatened fines, flight, or poor performance that cost the household money. The calorie investment mindset extended beyond the door. Manorial and urban institutions rewarded the same priorities, indirectly teaching households to copy them. On large estates, harvest time boon works came with specified rations of bread, cheese, and ale for reapers. Craft ordinances in towns set meal allowances for certain tasks. Even church fast regimes, while limiting meat and fats on particular days, tended to make exceptions or practical accommodations for those doing the heaviest labour. The message was consistent. Output justified intake. Risk management also pushed portions toward workers. Seed grain, draft animals and tools represented the family's capital. If the person responsible for those assets worked at half strength, breakdowns followed. Mis-sown seed, injured oxen, a wagon with a snapped axle. In a thin year, a single failure could erase the family's margin. Feeding the field hands first was presented as rational prevention, especially in the hungry gap when the household stood between dwindling stores and not yet ripe crops. There were, however, hidden costs that this arithmetic ignored. Repeated underfeeding of children during late winter and spring produced stunting and more frequent illness, which in turn drew adults away from fields to care duties. Women who cooked, fetched fuel, laundered and spun to meet clothier quotas burned steady calories that were rarely counted as investment. When those workers flagged, the entire system slowed, but the table rules often failed to adjust. In the worst seasons, households doubled down on the very policy that created long-term weakness. Allocation rituals reinforced the hierarchy. The first cuts from the loaf were made before anyone sat. Travel rations for men were wrapped and set aside. The thick ladlefuls were placed on specific trenchers. The rest of the pot was stretched with water for those remaining. Children learned the script: wait, keep quiet, receive what is left. The practice trained behaviour as much as it moved calories. Regularity limited disputes and waste, but it hardened assumptions about who deserved food most. Markets could tighten or loosen these patterns. In good years, when bread was abundant and dairy flowed, the edge softened. More even slices, occasional treats, broader access to fat. In dearth, prices climbed by late winter, and bought loaves shrank under the assize. Households responded by protecting worker portions and cutting from the bottom of the order. Parish alms and neighbourly sharing sometimes redirected food to children, but these were discretionary and variable by place. Evidence from account rolls, household ordinances and service contracts supports the outlines of this system, even when cottage-level details remain unrecorded. Where quantities were written, they named workers bread separately or listed harvest allowances by job. Where rules were oral, consistency shows up in court cases about underfeeding servants, in sermons praising thrift and diligence, and in later recollections that the men ate first. None of this proves that affection was absent. It shows that affection operated inside a tight frame of survival math. The flaw in the calorie investment mindset is clearer in hindsight than it was to people making daily choices under risk. A small reallocation to growing bodies and to invisible labour might have raised total household resilience, especially through spring sickness. But households favoured the immediate and measurable fieldwork completed today over the diffuse, longer-term returns of healthier children. If table choreography determined who ate first, it was usually the mother or senior woman who staged the performance. She controlled the bread chest, guarded the starter, judged the pot's thickness and turned abstract household priorities into slices and ladles. In most peasant homes, and many urban ones, the person with the knife and ladle was the manager of scarcity. Her work was not recorded in account rolls, but it set the practical limits of who ate what when. Portion control began before the meal. The manager planned the week's bake, choosing loaf size and flour mix to balance keeping quality against bulk. Coarser blends, maslin, rye, peas, stretched further and staled slower, allowing thinner daily cuts. She decided whether to cook pottage as a gruel, more water, more volume, or as a thicker stew, more calories per spoonful, fewer bowls. She kept a mental ledger of obligations, travel rations for workers, alms promised to a neighbour, a sick child's posset, and adjusted quantities accordingly. And that because fuel was limited, she coordinated boil times to piggyback tasks. Heat for pottage also warmed ale, dried damp wood or scalded a dairy cloth. Quiet triage happened at the cutting board, not in public debate. The first cuts, reserved for field hands or contracted servants, were measured against a rule, a thumb's width, a marked board. Next came negotiated portions, an older daughter who had washed in icy water, a boy who had ferried manure, an elder with bad teeth. The manager knew who had been sick last week and who was likely to fail this week. She could thin one person's ale and thicken another's bowl without announcing it. A common tactic was double-stage feeding, a smaller bread slice at table, but a later cup of hot pottage in the byre or yard when others were absent. This preserved the appearance of equal treatment while directing help to vulnerability. Saving face mattered because authority depended on legitimacy. Rationing favoured the household's perceived producers. Any deviation invited accusation of favouritism. The manager used impersonal rules, workers first, Sunday bigger, feast eve treat, to shield decisions. She leaned on custom, assize weights, parish fasts to justify smaller portions when prices rose. When stretching was unavoidable, she blamed the calendar. Lent is thin, the oven schedule, communal day is tomorrow, or the weather, the flour is damp. These explanations acknowledged scarcity without conceding mismanagement. Tools reinforced control. The bread chest key stayed with the manager, limiting unauthorised nibbling. Loaves were cooled on high racks and turned daily to prevent mould. Cutting occurred at set hours. The ladle size did administrative work. A deeper ladle for workers' trenchers, a shallower one for the rest. Bowls were not identical. A heavy earthen bowl held heat longer and delivered a sense of abundance. A shallow wooden dish cooled fast and signalled, eat slowly. The manager deployed vessels with intent. Children learned the system through tasks. They fetched water, gathered nettles, kept the starter warm, and swept stray grain from the miller's floor. Each chore trained them in the economy of crumbs, why seed grain could not be touched, why crusts were saved for broth, why nibbling spoiled the ledger. The manager used work as ration language. Help with spinning and you'll have the pan scrapings. Carry the bundle and you'll share the travel slice. This was not wholly transactional. It synchronized appetite with available food and reduced moments of open conflict. Illness and crisis exposed the manager's discretion. A coughing child received warm ale sweetened with a drop of honey or a thinned posset even if official portions were fixed. After a hard day's lambing, the woman who had not left the byre might be handed a larger slice behind the door. When charity loaves arrived from the parish, they were often broken privately and redistributed across 2 or 3 days rather than served whole at once. The public face of the table stayed consistent. The private schedule compensated for need. Markets and prices constrained choices, but also offered refinements. In towns, the manager could buy yesterday's loaves at a discount for gruels and save the fresh loaf for slices. She might substitute oatcakes on non-oven days, reserving scarce fuel. If the assize reduced loaf weight, she compensated with more water in the pot, extra cabbage, or a few fistfuls of peas. When a bit of cash appeared, fat was the preferred purchase, drippings, lard or oil, to raise the calorie density of the same volume of stew. These were small levers, but they accumulated into survival. Reputation was another asset. Managers cultivated ties with millers for honest grist, with bakers for early loaves, with neighbours for emergency swaps. A woman known for returning borrowed meal on time could borrow again in April. One who failed lost access just when the hungry gap peaked. Saving face extended beyond the hearth to the alley and church porch. It was credit in social form. None of this erased the structural hierarchy that put children last, but it shows that within a rigid order, the manager's hands softened edges, invisible top-ups, delayed feeding, selective thickening, and discreet gifts. The household avoided open quarrels, maintained the public rule of workers first, and still steered extra calories to the places most at risk. The same management that kept meals orderly also trained children into the household food economy. Mealtime was a lesson in timing and restraint. Children waited while first portions were cut and wrapped for workers. Only after the priority slices and thick ladlefuls moved to specific trenchers did the remaining bread and pottage circulate to the smaller bowls. The rule was explicit in many homes: quiet at table, hands down until called, and it produced a predictable outcome. Children ate last and learned to stretch what arrived. Crusts were central to that training. The browned base of a half-baked loaf travelled poorly and went stale more slowly, so families treated it as a durable child portion. Scrape rights from the pot, the caramelised ring where grain and fat caught, were also a recognised child share. Neither crust nor scrapings were nutritionally ideal compared with the thickest stew, but they delivered fibre, flavour and a sense of ownership. A manager could divide crusts evenly, assign them by rotation, or promise tomorrow's scraping to end disputes. These rules created a small economy of expectation that reduced snatching and bargaining at the table. Tasks synchronised appetite with availability. Before the meal, children fetched water, gathered fuel or brought in greens. After the meal, they wiped trenchers, saved crumbs for hens and rinsed bowls. Each job delayed immediate eating, but returned a modest benefit. A child entrusted with carrying the breadboard might be allowed to trim an edge. The one who tended the fire received the first warm cup of thin ale. The sequence turned waiting into participation, aligned children's satisfaction with the household's need for orderly service. Utensils reinforced hierarchy. Adults and workers ate from heavier earthen bowls that held heat and suggested abundance. Children used shallower wooden dishes that cooled quickly and discouraged rapid consumption. Spoons differed by size. A smaller spoon naturally lengthened a child's meal and made thin pottage feel less inadequate. These were not accidents of supply, but adaptations that managers used to pace eating and stretch volume. Discipline at table attached to broader moral lessons. Manuals and sermons praised patience, condemned gluttony, and folded mealtime behaviour into ideas of obedience. A child who waited quietly demonstrated virtue and, by extension, justified a small reward later. A heel of bread saved for bedtime, a sip of posset during illness, or an extra spoonful of stew when others were outdoors. Breaking the code, grabbing, complaining, sneaking, risked public correction, which parents framed as necessary to keep the household ledger balanced. Season and setting shaped the stakes. In the hungry gap, the gap between workers' portions and children's portions widened. In high summer and after harvest, it narrowed. Urban households sometimes had steadier access to purchased bread, but faced cash constraints and bakery shrinkage during price spikes. Rural families had garden produce and foraged greens, but depended on the success of sowing and livestock cycles. In either context, children's place at the end of the line remained consistent, even if the absolute amount of food varied. Education and service altered patterns. Schooled children, choir boys or petty school pupils, often received a morning bite before lessons and a main meal later, but their rations remained modest and supervised. Apprenticeship shifted a youth from child to worker status. Contracts commonly specified bread weight, meat days, or ale allowance. Once bound, an adolescent could eat ahead of younger siblings because his labour was now monetised and externally verified. Live-in servants likewise moved up the order, their portions protected by custom and oversight, even though they remained young. Illness provided the clearest exception. Household managers used separate channels to support sick children: warm broths, watered ale, diluted wine, and small sweetened preparations when available. These were administered outside the main meal to avoid disrupting the visible hierarchy. A child might still receive a small slice at table, then a private supplement later. Because illness threatened the household's labour indirectly, through lost time and increased care, these exceptions were tolerated and even expected. Charity and neighbourhood networks also intervened. Parish almsloaves, occasional fish distributions in Lent, and gifts from godparents gave managers flexibility. Many broke charity loaves immediately into measured rations for several days, reserving parts specifically for children. Bakers sometimes passed stale or underweight loaves cheaply to known families. These were soaked and turned into spoon bread for evening feedings that targeted the youngest. Such practices did not displace the rule of workers first, but they softened its effect. Children developed small strategies within the rules. They learned the ladle's rhythm and the likely leftovers. They sat near the person who cut slices. They volunteered for tasks that positioned them close to the crusts. None of this overturned allocation, but it increased the chance of a fuller belly without open conflict. Older siblings often acted as brokers, surrendering a portion to a toddler to avert crying, then quietly collecting a compensating bite from a parent after others left the table. The costs of this system are visible in demographic and medical records: stunting, seasonal spikes in childhood illness, and high mortality in late winter and spring. Yet it persisted because it delivered order and preserved capital, seed, stock, tools, under recurring scarcity. Children's patience and their attachment to crusts were not romantic quirks. They were adaptations to a household ledger that treated food as a controlled asset. Understanding children's place clarifies why households could behave consistently harsh by modern standards without intending cruelty. The end of the line was a training ground, a rationing mechanism, and a social script. The household choreography that kept children last in line operated within a larger calendar that told everyone what could be served and when. Church time shaped kitchen time. Across much of medieval Europe, fasts, vigils, and weekly abstinence days set legal and moral limits on meat, fat, and meal frequency. Those limits did not erase scarcity, they redirected it, sometimes making meals smaller and sometimes making them taste unfamiliar to modern expectations. The most demanding stretch was Lent, 40 days before Easter, not counting Sundays. Many regions required abstinence from meat. In stricter customs, dairy and eggs were also forbidden. For households already thinning the pot in the hungry gap, this meant removing the very foods that added calories and flavour. The result was lean pottage bulked with cereals and roots, fish when affordable, and fats replaced with oil where available. In England, northern France, and parts of the Empire, fish markets became critical: salted herring, stockfish, dried cod, and river fish substituted for meat. Stockfish required long soaking and heavy fuel to soften, adding strain to firewood budgets. In inland villages without good fish supply, Lenten cooking could be simply thinner gruel and more greens. Weekly abstinence also mattered. Fridays, and often Wednesdays or Saturdays, were meatless in many places. Vigils of major feasts added extra no-meat days. The rhythm pushed kitchens toward routinized lean menus several times each week: pea pottage, onions with oats, cabbage with oil, bread thickened ale soups. For children at the end of the line, these days frequently meant smaller usable calories, since the missing meat and dairy were not fully replaced. Managers compensated with volume, more water, more bread if available, but the net effect was fewer calories per bowl. Feasting worked in the opposite direction, but not always for children. Major feasts, Easter, Christmas, patronal festivals, increased availability of rich dishes. Meat, spiced pies, ale and special white breads. Guilds and parishes sponsored church ales or communal meals. Lords staged largesse. Yet even on feast days, distribution followed rank. In a great hall, high table took the roasts. Servers and children watched the procession before scraps and trenchers reached them. At household level, feast eves might relax rules, extra finger widths of bread, a bit of honey, a cheese course. But priority slices still went to workers and guests. Children tasted the festival. They did not necessarily feast by modern measure. The rules also made meals stranger by modern tastes through substitutions and workarounds. In places where dairy was forbidden in Lent, almond milk became a status ingredient for those who could afford almonds. Poorer homes used water thickened with ground peas or bread. Fish required sauces to counter saltiness or dryness, mustard, vinegar or herb mixtures, which altered flavour profiles. There were also category quirks. Waterfowl and, in some texts, beaver tail could be counted as fish, widening options for those with access. Monastic kitchens developed elaborate Lenten recipes that filtered into urban households with means. Rural cottages adopted the simplified versions, still different enough to mark the day as unusual. Meal timing shifted under fast rules. On strict fast days, the principal meal might be delayed until afternoon, after the canonical hour of none. For children, this meant a longer wait even before eating last. Managers often introduced quiet workarounds, a morning collation, a drink of thin ale or water with a crust, to keep the youngest from faintness while preserving the letter of the fast at the main meal. Such supplements were kept discreet to avoid the appearance of breaking discipline. Dispensations complicated the landscape. Labourers performing heavy work, the sick, pregnant or nursing women, and travellers could receive relaxations from clergy. In practice, these dispensations were unevenly applied or informally interpreted. A day of ditching might justify a thicker pottage or a meat portion for the worker, while the rest of the family remained on lean fare. That looked like mercy. For children, it often translated to even sharper differentials on fast days because the available rich portion was reserved for the dispensed adult. Markets responded to the calendar, reinforcing patterns. Fish prices climbed before Lent. Oils, olive in the south, hemp linseed in the north, did the same. Bakers produced special white loaves for feast days and coarser breads for everyday lean times. Charity distribution also followed church time. Lenten alms loaves were common, and parishes organised fish or bread doles tied to specific fasts or saints' days. Managers broke these charity loaves into scheduled rations, often earmarking a portion for children. Still, the overall calorie picture in Lent usually dipped for the smallest. Monastic and institutional rules illustrate the principles starkly. Benedictine houses distinguished between flesh days and fish days with separate kitchens, misericords, to prevent cross-contamination. Their detailed accounts show how strictly the calendar shaped ingredients. Urban hospitals recorded different bread and pottage allowances for fast and flesh days, with workers' rations protected even under lean menus. Households, though less documented, mirrored these practices in simpler form. Feasts did yield some benefits for children beyond the taste of rare foods. Processions and guild meals generated leftovers, almsgiving was more visible, and visiting kin brought small gifts, fruit, nuts, sweetened breads. But the structural hierarchy rarely paused. The public face of abundance coexisted with familiar private portioning. First slices set aside for labourers, then measured bowls for everyone else, with the youngest receiving after the spectacle ended. In short, church rules did not simply add piety to the plate, they reallocated scarcity and reshaped taste. Fast days took calories out of common reach and stretched the manager's ingenuity. Feast days raised supply but preserved rank in distribution. Children learned two scripts: on lean days, longer waiting and thinner bowls; on rich days, more sights and smells, not always more substance. Parish charity did not abolish the household queue. It gave managers a few more entries in the ledger. Medieval and early modern communities distributed food in patterned ways. Weekly doles, Lenten extras, funeral alms, guild gifts, each with rules about who qualified how much and when. Understanding these mechanics explains why charity helped many children indirectly, but rarely moved to the front of any line. The most common form was the bread dole. Testators endowed sole loaves, panis pro animibus, to be given on an anniversary or weekly at the church door. Church wardens or confraternities bought flour or contracted a baker to supply a set number of penny loaves. The number was fixed by the bequest. The size floated with grain prices under the assize. In dear years, the penny loaf shrank. Donors seldom specified weight, so scarcity translated into thinner charity as well as thinner commerce. Distribution followed liturgical time. Doles were often handed out after Mass or Vespers, sometimes at a dole stone or table by the porch to keep crowds away from the nave. Tickets or tallies managed demand. Recipients presented a token issued earlier in the week limiting repeat claims. Parish officers prioritised resident poor, widows, the elderly, the chronically ill over itinerants. Children rarely appeared as independent claimants. They came folded into a widow's or labourer's household. Other channels supplemented bread. Church ales raised funds. Parishioners brewed and sold ale at a feast, then used proceeds for repairs and charity, occasionally including cooked pottage or fish on fast days. Guilds and fraternities kept their own alms funds and dispensed loaves to members' widows and orphans. Hospitals provided measured rations to the sick, poor and travellers. In towns, endowed kitchens served thin soups at set hours. Each system had gatekeepers, wardens, beadles, hospital stewards, who converted pious intent into lists and ladles. Who actually received the bread depended on local definitions of deserving. Moral reputation mattered. Parish officers favoured the visibly settled and compliant poor. Chronic drunkards, quarrellers or newcomers could be excluded. Seasonal workers in from the fields might receive occasional help during Lent or the hungry gap, but without parish settlement they sat at the back of the alms queue. Mothers with infants were persuasive claimants. Older children standing alone were less so unless attached to a known household. Quantities were small but timely. A standard dole might be 1 penny loaf per ticket, sometimes paired with a ladle of ale or a herring on fast days. Households treated the loaf as a multi-day asset. Managers commonly broke it into 3 or 4 measured rations, soaking slices into spoon bread for evening feedings or thickening a pot for the youngest. From a child's perspective, charity loaves often arrived not as a single treat, but as a series of slightly fuller bowls spread across days. Seasonality sharpened impact. Lenten alms and pre-Easter distributions coincided with the hungry gap when household stores were lowest. That timing made a small loaf more valuable than the same loaf in September. Conversely, price spikes reduced the weight of both market and charity bread simultaneously. A bequest for 50 loaves looked generous on paper, but delivered less substance precisely when need peaked. Some parishes tried to hedge by contracting for weight rather than count. Many did not. Administration introduced leakage. Bakers supplying doles balanced charity orders with paying customers. Late deliveries or overbaked loaves were tolerated. Tickets could be lost, forged or traded. Parish officers faced accusations of favouritism, handing extras to kin or to those who voted predictably in vestry disputes. Periodic view of the poor lists attempted to reset eligibility, but turnover remained. None of this eliminated real help. It did mean that the poorest without social ties were the most exposed. Alms linked to life cycle events created spikes. Funerals and obits often included bread and small coins for the poor at the church gate. Large bequests produced visible crowds and, occasionally, disorder. Beadles imposed lines, separating settled poor from outsiders. Children present at such events usually ate that day. Public generosity discouraged stinginess, but the effect was temporary. Regular weekly doles mattered more to the household ledger. Did charity move children forward? Indirectly. Mothers used parish loaves to top up the youngest outside the public meal, preserving the appearance of the worker-first order while shifting calories in private. Godparents and neighbours echoed the system with occasional gifts, a heel of white bread after a baptismal feast, a leftover fish during Lent, that managers converted into child-focused feedings. Where hospitals distributed broth, children sometimes received a cup at the gate. More often, the broth went to an adult patient and was shared at home. Urban versus rural differences were practical rather than principled. Towns had more institutions, guilds, hospitals, endowed kitchens, and more frequent doles, but also higher competition and stricter residency expectations. Villages had fewer donors, yet stronger knowledge of who was truly needy, which reduced fraud but tethered access to reputation. In both settings, charity did not dismantle household hierarchies. It gave managers inputs to reallocate quietly. Finally, oversight tied almsgiving to discipline. Wardens used access to doles to reward orderly poor. Those who attended services avoided begging in the nave and did small parish tasks. That moral filter shaped which households could rely on predictable help when the hungry gap bit hardest. For children, the result was uneven. Where a mother kept standing with the wardens, small, steady supplements flowed. Where reputation faltered, the queue lengthened and the bowl thinned. In some, charity loaves mattered most as schedule and signal. They arrived at predictable times, in small, assize-shadowed units that managers could plan around. They rarely transformed a child's place at table, but they softened extremes and bought days until gardens and fields began to answer back. Next, we turn to the parish pot itself, how communal broths and poor men's portions were organised, and whether those kettles ever truly put the smallest first. If charity loaves were counted items, the parish pot was measured by ladle. Many European parishes and confraternities maintained a kettle for the poor on set days, especially in Lent, on vigils and near major feasts. Church wardens or a lay brotherhood provided grain, peas, onions, and occasionally fish. A hired cook or parish widow tended the fire. The stated aim was simple: one hot portion for those who could not afford fuel or ingredients. In practice, organisation created a second queue layered over the household one, with its own pecking order and rules. Funding determined the recipe. Endowments specified ingredients: a bushel of peas weekly in Lent, herring for the poor on Fridays, and vestry minutes show small purchases: salt, oil, firewood, approved alongside repairs. When income was thin, the broth was thinner: more water, fewer peas, longer boiling. Donors sometimes required prayers or commemorations in return. The pot became part of parish display as well as relief. Guild kitchens worked similarly, though targeted to members' widows and orphans first, then to the general poor, if supplies remained. Eligibility was policed. A beadle or churchwarden kept a list of resident poor and issued tallies or tokens redeemable for a serving. Strangers were served last or not at all unless a donor explicitly directed open distribution. The sick and elderly often stood high on the list. Children on their own rarely did. Mothers arrived with jugs or bowls and carried portions back to the hearth. Another reason the parish pot's impact on children was indirect, routed through the household manager who decided how to integrate it into the day's ration. Serving logistics reproduced hierarchy. Ladling began at a set hour, commonly after a service, to fold discipline into charity. Those with tokens stood closest, those without waited. Portions were notionally standard, a ladle or two per head, but practice varied by beadle, cook and pressure at the queue. A known widow might receive a slightly deeper dip, an itinerant a skim from the top. On fish days, pieces of herring or a shred of stockfish were meant to be evenly distributed. Bones and small bits tended to cluster at the end of the line. Containers mattered. Households with sturdy earthenware bowls carried heat home. Those with cracked wooden noggins lost half their portion on the walk. Some parishes kept loaner bowls marked with a cross to reduce spillage and theft. The last to be served often got the worst vessels. Spillage, in effect, acted as another means test. Poorer equipment meant smaller effective rations, even when the ladle was technically equal. Seasonality influenced who showed up and what was served. In the hungry gap, attendance swelled and recipes leaned on pulses and onions. Herbs appeared as soon as they sprouted. In coastal towns, the pot took on a maritime flavour. Fish heads and frames boiled long with oats. Inland, pea pottage dominated. Fuel costs were non-trivial. A portion of the alms fund covered wood, and on windy days, cooks shortened simmering to conserve fuel, reducing softening and digestibility for the frail. Supervision aimed at fairness but also at order. Wardens discouraged repeat servings by stamping tokens or making recipients display an empty bowl before refilling. Children sent in place of adults were common, another sign that the parish pot flowed into household management rather than directly to small mouths. A child might sip a few spoonfuls on the path home, but most of the portion was absorbed into the family pot, stretched with water and bread to cover more bowls at the evening meal. Communal broths intersected with private gifts. Better-off parishioners sometimes added a jug of oil or a handful of barley on the day, nudging quality up without changing the serving rule. At funerals and obits, extra kettles were set up. Bequests specified poor men's portions, increasing size for a day or two. These spikes helped, but did not reconfigure regular priority. The same beadles held the ladles, the same lists governed the line, and the same households with stable reputations received steadier servings over months. Conflicts arose and were recorded. Complaints about watery soup, short ladles, or favouritism appear in vestry notes and occasional ecclesiastical court cases. Remedies were administrative, not structural. New measures for ladles, posted serving times, renewed lists. The goal was consistency and quiet, not a rethinking of who should eat first within homes. Parish officers saw their role as supplementing subsistence, not revising domestic hierarchy. Health considerations were mixed. Hot broth improved immediate comfort and hydration, and the long boil lowered some contamination risks. But without fat or adequate protein, the calories remained low, especially in Lent. For children, digestibility mattered. Peas inadequately softened caused stomach upset. Oversalted fish broths were hard on the very young. Managers learned to dilute parish servings at home, add a scrap of fat if available, and schedule consumption for evening when smaller bodies tired. Did the parish pot ever put children first? Only in particular programmes. Some confraternities endowed specific children's portions on saint days, and a few hospitals had rules for orphans' bowls at the gate. More commonly, the system assumed the household would allocate internally. The pot's real contribution was predictability. Knowing that on Wednesdays and Fridays a ladle could be fetched allowed the manager to reduce that day's home pottage and redirect saved grain toward a child's breakfast or a sick member's posset. In that sense, communal broth supported the quiet reallocation already happening behind doors. By itself, the parish pot could not erase the hungry gap or overturn the worker-first logic at table. It functioned as a communal safety valve, publicly visible, morally satisfying, and modestly sustaining. For a child at the end of the line, it often meant a slightly fuller evening bowl rather than a larger public serving. Parish broths and charity loaves added predictable bumps to the household ledger, but inside the door, allocation still followed the principle that rations tracked usefulness. For children, usefulness meant chores. The equation was rarely written, but frequently enforced. Work first, then eat. It trained small bodies to the needs of a subsistence household and gave managers a rationing language that preserved public order while rewarding cooperation. Herding was the archetypal child task. From 6 or 7, boys and girls were set to mind geese, pigs, or a few cattle at the edge of common fields. The job freed adults for heavier work, protected crops from damage fines, and generated manure where needed. It also kept children away from the hearth at mealtimes. Many households packed a small ration, a crust, a heel of cheese if available, and a cup of thin ale into a cloth for the herder's day, with the promise of a larger bowl on return. Failures had costs. A strayed animal could mean a crop trespass penalty payable in grain or cash. Managers used food to signal reliability. A child who kept the geese off the barley strip reliably might see their evening portion thickened. One who allowed damage might face the opposite. Fetching water and fuel anchored the daily schedule and justified earlier bites. Cottages without wells sent children with yokes and buckets to a communal source. Fuel meant deadwood, gorse, or peat, depending on region. These tasks consumed hours and energy. The manager often tied them to collations, sanctioned sips and nibbles outside the main meal that did not disturb the public order at table. A child returning wet and shivering could be handed a warmed cup of ale and a trim from the loaf behind the door, then told to wait quietly at dinner. The visible hierarchy, workers first, remained intact. The invisible supplements flowed through chores. Spinning brought girls, and sometimes boys, into the production chain that fed cash back into the pantry. Rural clothiers and urban merchants set out wool or flax with return quotas. Mothers and daughters spun by the hearth, and in season outdoors, counts were recorded by hanks and knots. Under-quota work cut cash or in-kind payments that bought oil, salt or bread. In that context, a girl's ration rose when her numbers did. Managers tracked output and adjusted quietly. A thicker evening bowl for the child whose distaff emptied on time. A warning and a thinner pottage for the one who dawdled. The message was clear. Spinning kept the soup richer. Sweeping, scouring pots, picking over grain, and sorting dried peas gave younger children a pathway to small rewards. These tasks reduced waste, recovering kernels from the floor, removing stones that cracked teeth, keeping vermin down. Because they took place in the house, they also gave managers opportunities for measured top-ups without attracting complaint. A child scouring a pot could scrape browned residue into a mug and, with permission, add hot water to make a private broth. The practice turned leftovers into sanctioned snacks and tied them to diligence rather than demand. Seasonal work intensified the curriculum. Lambing, haymaking, gleaning, berrying and nut gathering all relied on children. In lambing weeks, older children sat up with ewes, fetched warm water and carried messages. During hay, they turned light swaths and stacked. Gleaning after harvest was explicitly a children's enterprise in many places. Statutes regulated when they could enter fields and how much they could carry. These weeks produced the rare inversion of the queue. A child who returned with a basket of nuts or a hem full of fallen ears might be offered a first taste of a treat, honey, hot milk, or a sliver of cheese before the main meal as recognition. The gesture reinforced the link between contribution and calories without rewriting the standard order. Schooling did not cancel chores. Petty school and song school hours were short, leaving mornings or afternoons for work. Masters sometimes allowed pupils to eat a crust during breaks. At home, the rule held tasks completed before the larger portion. In towns, errands replaced herding, delivering thread to a factor, carrying a customer's purchase, or queuing at the bakehouse. Urban managers used the same tools as rural ones, a collated nibble for punctual return, a thinner ladle for a lost coin or late delivery. Contracts formalised the relationship for apprentices and live-in servants. Once bound, youths moved to worker status with specified bread weights and meat days. But entry into service usually followed years of pre-contract chores at home. Families used rations to test reliability before risking a child's reputation with a master. A steady pattern, no sneaking from the bread chest, no dropped buckets, no missing geese, predicted success and justified the food that kept an adolescent growing towards service age. Health pressures cut across the system. Managers recognised that hard tasks drained small bodies. On cold days, children sent for water received extra heated drink on return. In sickness, collations turned into prescribed broths. Yet even these exceptions kept the grammar of chores before chunks. A child too weak to fetch might be fed first as a cure, with the expectation of resumed tasks. The focus remained functional, food restored capacity, discipline handled breaches, stealing from the bread chest, eating before tasks or feigning a chore threatened the household ledger. Punishments ranged from public rebuke at table to a temporary exclusion from a treat day, feast eve honey, end of week white loaf. Because managers needed cooperation, penalties rarely removed all food. They targeted status within the small economy of extras. The aim was calibration, not cruelty. Finally, the hungry curriculum made children legible in market terms. A child known to herd reliably could be hired out seasonally for small wages or in-kind pay. Grain, a pair of shoes, a blanket, bringing resources back. That external validation fed the internal ration logic. Once the community rated a child's work, the household shifted the child upward in portion priority on heavy days. In effect, local labour markets echoed and hardened the connection between work and food inside the door. The system's limits were plain. Requiring labour to access fuller rations in a season of scarcity pushed weaker children to the edge and masked the caloric needs of light but constant tasks. Yet for managers balancing a thin pot, chores provided a practical method to schedule eating, prevent disputes and keep essential work done. The household that tied rations to chores eventually formalised the practice. What began as a manager's quiet top-ups, an extra ladle after water fetching, a crust for sweeping, hardened into a recognizable exchange. Additional work earned additional food. It looked efficient. In reality, it made children's intake volatile, favoured the already strong, and pushed the weakest further behind. The mechanism was simple. Managers set a baseline portion, thin pottage, a small slice of coarse bread, and then announced opportunities, carry a message to the next farm, bring peat from the stack, card a basket of wool, turn a distaff's worth of thread, watch the geese until dusk. Completion added a tangible bonus, a thicker evening ladle, a finger-width more bread, a scrap of cheese, sweetened ale on cold days. The structure reduced open conflict. Children competed through service rather than argument, but it also converted calories into wages without the protections found in formal service contracts. Timing amplified the inequality. Heavier tasks clustered when food was scarcest. Late winter ditching, lambing, early spring water runs through mud, spinning quotas before clothier's collection days. The child strongest at the start of the hungry gap could complete more tasks and therefore buy more food. The child who began thin or ill fell short of tasks and missed the very calories that might have restored strength. Day by day, the gap widened. Geography and household assets mattered. A cottage near a well set shorter water errands than one at the edge of the village. Proximity to commons changed herding demands. Access to a wheel or swift accelerated spinning. Children in better situated homes could complete more earnable tasks in the same daylight. Those in cramped, fuel-poor cottages faced longer, colder trips and fewer tools, turning the same exchange rate into a worse bargain. Not all extra work yielded equal food. Tasks close to the hearth, scouring pots, sweeping, picking stones from grain, earned small immediate crumbs. Out-of-sight tasks, fence mending, messages, late geese watch, earned delayed, sometimes forgotten bonuses. Managers were not necessarily unjust. They were busy. But a system that paid imperishables and memory inevitably shored some contributors, especially quiet children or those returning after dark. Gender and age skewed returns. Boys performing visible outdoor tasks, hauling, herding, cart help, often received recognisable extras at the main meal. Girls spinning, though central to cash income, paid out in private. A thicker cup at bedtime, an extra mouthful while clearing the board. Younger children with small chores accumulated tokens that rarely matched the caloric burn of constant movement. Because their tasks seemed light, their bonuses stayed light, even when the day's total effort was high. Markets reinforced the scheme. Clothiers and factors paid mothers in cash or flour for completed hanks. Managers then tied a child's intake to quota performance. Shortfall 1 week meant less cash for oil or bread, and within the home a warning and thinner pottage for the child spinner. Conversely, a burst of output, often from an older, stronger adolescent, funded richer stews that primarily fed workers the next day. Children saw the rule confirmed: production first, distribution later, and not always to the producer. Charity did not fix the pattern. Parish loaves and broths gave managers slack, but bonuses still followed the household's merit scale. A charity loaf might be earmarked for the diligent gooseminder rather than the sickly sibling. The stated reason, to reward good keeping, aligned with community values of thrift and diligence. Godparent gifts flowed similarly. A white roll handed to the child who ran the message to the godparent's shop, not to the one who waited with the baby. Publicly, the system taught responsibility. Privately, it starved those least able to compete. Rule-making tried to keep the exchange from derailing order. Managers posted informal tariffs: 1 ladle for a full basket of peat, a crust for 3 hanks, the pan scrapings if you finish before none. The clarity reduced disputes, but it also invited gaming. Older children cherry-picked tasks with better food returns and left low-pay chores to younger siblings. When daylight was short, the family's task list could go unfinished because the rates favoured visible jobs over necessary but low-reward labour like sweeping or grain picking. Punishments interacted with earned bites in destabilising ways. A missed task or a lie about completion drew penalties: loss of a bonus, demotion in the order for a meal, exclusion from a treat on feast eve. Because penalties were applied when food was already tight, they cut deeply. A child who failed once, dropping a bucket, losing a coin, lost both a bonus and a portion of baseline status, descending further in the next day's race to earn back food. The health ledger tells the outcome. The earned bites regime produced sharp intra-household variation in child growth, especially across a hungry gap. Robust children sometimes maintained or even gained modestly. Frailer siblings lost weight, fell ill, and missed more tasks, compounding the deficit. Managers tried to offset crises with doctoring. Possets, watered ale, a soft slice dipped in broth, but these were exceptional, not structural. The daily rule, bonus follows task, resumed as soon as the child stood. None of this implies cynicism on the part of parents. The system emerged from a need to motivate work without cash, keep peace without endless scolding, and allocate scarce food with a surface of fairness. But its economics were unforgiving. It rewarded output, not need, memory, not invisibility, proximity, not distance. By the time earned bites had turned children's food into a variable wage, managers leaned on liquids to keep the youngest upright. Drinks and drinkable foods, small beer, watered ale, whey, thin milk where available, and especially thin pottage, were the cheapest, quickest, and least disruptive way to add energy and warmth without rewriting the public order of slices at table. In many homes, the most reliable child calories during the hungry gap arrived in cups and ladles, not on trenchers. Small beer, very low alcohol ale, anchored this strategy. Brewing cycles in cottages and towns produced a first, stronger runnings for workers and guests, and a second or third runnings, small beer, for daily drinking. It was safer than much surface water, provided modest calories from residual malt sugars, and could be warmed quickly. Managers rationed by mug size and dilution. A half mug for a toddler, a full mug watered for older children, plain water for washing down the thinnest potages. Because small beer soured quickly, it favoured frequent small servings, the very pattern that fit child top-ups between public meals. Where dairying allowed, whey and buttermilk played similar roles. Late winter was the lean point for milk. Still, any byproduct from butter making or freshening cows could be warmed and salted into a serviceable drink for a child with cough or listlessness. In regions where Lenten rules forbade dairy, managers substituted hot water with a drop of oil or ale warmed with herbs, keeping the pattern of sips without breaking the fast. Institutions sometimes issued collations, evening drinks, on fast days. Households mirrored the practice privately for children, treating a mug of small beer or thin gruel as outside the main ration. Thin pottage, essentially drinkable porridge, was the other pillar. It stretched grain dramatically, allowed precise portioning by ladle, and could incorporate whatever was at hand: oat or barley meal pea flour, cabbage water, or a handful of early greens. Unlike slices of bread, which were conspicuous and hard to reallocate without comment, a manager could thicken one child's cup slightly and thin another's without challenging the visible hierarchy. Fuel efficiency mattered. A pot simmering for the family could yield multiple child ladles across a day with minimal extra wood. Safety and digestion shaped choices. Water sources varied in quality. Boiling inside thin pottage reduced risk of stomach complaints common in spring. Long-cooked peas softened better for small bodies when served as drinkable soup than as lumpy stew. Managers recognised which recipes sat well: oat gruels for toddlers, pea water for older children, barley broth when bellies were unsettled. Sweetening was rare but strategic: a spoon of honey from a neighbour, a scrap of dried fruit, or ale warmed with a shaving of spice after a feast could coax a sick child to drink when they refused solids. Containers and scheduling mattered. Earthenware mugs held heat. Small wooden noggins cooled quickly but were safer for toddlers. Rationing by vessel size gave fine control. The same pot produced different outcomes by cup rather than by slice. Managers embedded sips into the daily timetable, on return from water fetching after the midday rush when workers had left for fields, or at evening when a child's patience frayed during slower service. These invisible feedings preserved the public rule of workers first while addressing child need at lower social cost. Markets and prices pushed the system toward liquids. When the assize shrank the penny loaf, families bought less bread and diverted grain to the pot, where it served more mouths per unit. Malt prices governed the strength of small beer. In dear years, beer weakened and managers substituted more thin pottage. Urban households purchased small beer from alewives by the jug, often yesterday's brew at a discount. Rural households brewed episodically, timing batches to coincide with heavy work and Lenten constraints. Medical reasoning, though pre-modern, supported the practice. Humoral advice favoured warm, moist foods for the weak, especially in cold, dry seasons. Household doctoring drew on that logic. Possets, hot ale with milk or whey, where permitted, barley waters and herb infusions, fennel, mint, horehound, mild enough for children. Even without formal theory, experience taught that sips soothed coughs, replaced fluids during spring fevers, and kept energy steady for light chores. Church time intersected predictably. On strict fast days, a child might receive a warm drink before none to prevent faintness without presenting a solid meal. After Vespers, households often served a thin evening gruel, socially marked as a collation, not a feast, letting children sleep warmer. Feast eves loosened the pattern. Sips could be thicker, sometimes with a drop of fat or an egg in later periods when rules allowed exceptions for the frail. The limits were clear. Liquids rarely matched the calorie density of bread plus fat or meat. A day of sips could forestall collapse but not reverse long deficits in growing bodies. Moreover, the earned bites logic still shadowed liquids. A child who completed errands might get first access to the evening ladle. One who dawdled waited. Yet compared to slices, sips were more elastic and less visible, enabling managers to correct the most dangerous gaps, dehydration, chills, post-illness weakness, without public negotiation. Finally, liquids served as social glue. Sharing a hot mug in the byre, handing a drowsy child a warm cup at the hearth, or sending a sibling to a neighbour for a fill from the brew pot reinforced reciprocal ties that could be converted into bread later. Alewives sometimes topped off a child's jug on credit. Hospitals and guild kitchens distributed evening broths that mothers thinned at home for younger mouths. In short, when the household economy pushed children to the end of the line and earned bites made solids uncertain, managers stabilised the day with sips. Small beer, whey and thin pottage provided warmth, modest energy, safer fluids and a flexible rationing tool. The schedule of collations and sips worked only if a pot was always ready to ladle. In lean months, that pot was less a recipe than a system. Bulk with cheap staples, boil long, portion by ladle, and refresh through the day. The rule of thumb was plain: make it many, make it thin, so that every return to the hearth could yield a warm cup, especially for children, without collapsing the household's ration plan. Oats were the most compliant grain for this purpose. Oatmeal thickened quickly, tolerated repeated dilution, and stayed suspended in liquid better than coarser meals. Cooks kept a small bowl of dry meal near the hearth and whisked in handfuls to rescue a pot that had become watery after multiple servings. Barley meal behaved similarly, but needed longer cooking. Managers paired barley with an earlier start or with yesterday's second heating. Wheat flour was rarely wasted on pottage. Rye and maslin were saved for bread. The point of an oat or barley-based base was controllable viscosity. One ladle could be made child-friendly and drinkable, another for a worker, barely pourable. Peas, field peas, provided protein and body, but they demanded forethought. Good practice meant sorting to pull weevil-scarred peas, overnight soaking, and a long simmer to avoid gritty skins, fuel-intensive steps that not every cottage could afford daily. Many compromised. Cook a large peas pottage once, then extend it for 2 days with water and grain meal. Managers skimmed scum, fished out loosened skins for the hens, and stabilised texture with a last-minute oat sprinkle. When fish was available, a few shreds of soaked stockfish or a spoon of herring liquor lifted flavour without changing the ration. Cabbage, coleworts and their cousins was the reliable bulk. Overwintered cabbages and early spring coal shoots went straight to the pot with onions or leeks. Leaves softened quickly, added volume, and crucially survived dilution. A morning pot might begin as cabbage oat with a little pea stock. By afternoon, after several dippings, it became cabbage water with a dusting of meal. The same logic applied to foraged greens: nettles, sorrel, goosefoot. Early in the hungry gap, they appeared as handfuls to tint and scent the broth. Later, when they were plentiful, they became the main substance. Fuel economy shaped every choice. A pot hung from a trammel or sat on a trivet, where embers could keep it at a low simmer without constant wood. Families planned long boils, peas, stockfish, on wash days or bake days when the hearth was already blazing, then lived off reheats. Earthen pipkins allowed smaller side batches, barley water for a sick child without disturbing the main cauldron. Because fuel was money, cooks preferred techniques that extended with minimal reheating, adding hot water from the kettle, stirring in oats, and serving quickly. Flavouring followed price and distance. Salt was precious, vinegar or verjuice sharpened thin pots cheaply. Mustard from local seed and horseradish gave heat where pepper was unaffordable. A spoon of saved drippings or a nub of lard, if available, was the most coveted improvement, doubling the calorie density of the same ladle. In Lent, households in oil-using regions leaned on hemp, linseed, or olive oil to mimic that effect. Elsewhere, cooks accepted flatness and compensated with onions and herbs. Portion control lived in the ladle. The first draws, often for workers, came from the pot's lower, thicker stratum. The cook stirred only after those servings left the hearth. Water was then added along the side and folded in for the rest, protecting the visible rule of heavier for labour while maintaining temperature for successive cups. Children's mugs were smaller by design. Their portions could be offered more often without appearing to rival trenchers. When a child struggled with texture, the manager sieved a cup through a coarse cloth, turning peas and oats into a smooth gruel that went down without complaint. Safety and storage were constant concerns. Each additional hour on the hearth invited souring in warm weather and starling in cold. Skimming and a hard boil at day's end helped, as did transferring leftovers to a smaller vessel to reduce exposure. Many kitchens practiced a loose, perpetual pot. Yesterday's remainder seeded today's start, especially peas pottage. The practice saved fuel and time, but required close attention. Off smells meant starting over, a loss painful in March. Bread interacted with the pot as a stretcher, not a rival. Sops, stale slices soaked in pottage, turned a child's crust into a filling meal without increasing the bread ration. Trenchers scraped after workers ate returned to the pot, taking with them fat and fond. Households that bought bread in town reserved the day-old loaf for sops and saved the fresher loaf for public slicing, a small theatre that protected dignity while favouring function. Markets and institutions nudged recipes week to week. When the assize shrank loaves, cottages diverted more grain to the pot. When parish pots served on Wednesdays and Fridays, managers planned thinner home pottages those evenings and thicker child cups in the morning, relying on the church ladle to cover supper. If a clothier paid in flour, the next day's pot got a noticeable upgrade. If payment lagged, cabbage did the heavy lifting. Medical habit layered onto practice. Households believed warm, moist food steadied the weak. Barley water and thin oat gruels were standard for feverish children. Cooks kept separate doctoring mugs, clean, smaller, easy to heat, so ailing mouths received prompt sips without queuing. Those cups represented the humane margin inside a harsh system, a way to correct the worst deficits without advertising a break from the public order of slices. In sum, the hungry kitchen worked by managing viscosity, heat and sequence. Oats and barley offered control, peas delivered body when fuel allowed, and cabbage and greens made volume. The pot stretch, first thick then thin, aligned with the household's priorities while leaving room for invisible kindness in cups. Next, we turn from ingredients to technique economies. Second boilings, pan scrapings, and why the order of stirring and serving decided who met the day strong and who went to bed on broth. The same technique economies that managed viscosity and heat extended to the final millimetres of food stuck to metal and clay. In many households, nothing equalled the value of the browned residue, the fond on an iron pan, the caramelised ring left by peas pottage, the drippings that collected under roasting meat on feast days. Scrape rights were the informal rules that decided who received those last, richest scraps. They conserved calories, reduced quarrels, and quietly reinforced hierarchy. Cookware shaped what there was to claim. Everyday boiling happened in hanging cauldrons or three-legged pots. Thick pottages left a tacky film that could be loosened with hot water and a wooden spatula. Frying and toasting on a bake stone or iron girdle produced crisp frills around oatcakes or bread slices. On bake day, bread bottoms shed a toasted skin that could be shaved off. In better-off homes, a dripping pan set beneath a joint yielded congealed fat and juices after cooling. Even poor cottages generated a daily residue, the pot ring where grain met heat. Managers recognised two competing claims. First, scraping improved the next dish if returned to the pot. Diluted scrapings added flavour and fat to thin gruels. Second, scraping provided a targeted treat to whoever received the right to eat it directly. Households solved the competition with routine. Thick morning servings for workers came first from the undisturbed lower pot. After those bowls left the table, the cook added water, loosened the ring and decided whether to pour it back into the pot for general use or reserve it as a discreet right for a person. Who held the right varied by season and policy. In many families, children received scrape rights as compensation for coming last to the main serving. The rule might rotate by day or attach to chores. The scouring child gets the scrapings. This practice kept peace and turned cleaning into a reward rather than a punishment. In other homes, the right belonged to the toughest task of the day, a lambing watch, a peat carry in sleet, or a double distance to the well. On feast eves, the right sometimes went to a guest or godchild to display hospitality without cutting into primary portions. Fuel, fasting, and fat affected the stakes. In Lent, where dairy and meat fats were restricted, the browned vegetable sugars and any remnant oil in a pan were some of the only concentrated calories available. Scrape rights, therefore, mattered more and were watched more closely. On meat days outside Lent, drippings conferred high energy. Managers commonly returned a portion to the pot for general flavour, then divided the remainder between the worker trenchers and a designated child's sop. The same logic applied to bakery scrapings. Shavings from a well-fired loaf sweetened a child's cup of ale or turned water into a sop without cutting a new slice. Custom reduced disputes. Some cottages used a fixed calendar, eldest child on Mondays, next on Tuesdays down the line, servants on Saturdays before the oven was swept, the elderly on Sundays. Others marked the breadboard or wall with charcoal ticks to record whose turn approached. Where apprentices lived in, masters often reserved pan scrapings for them rather than for younger children, arguing that a contracted worker's output warranted the bonus. That choice reflected external oversight. Shorting an apprentice's food could bring complaints, whereas a house's own children had no such contract. Discipline ran through the practice. Sneaking a scrape before the manager declared the right was treated as theft from the household, not just pilfering from the cook. Punishments targeted status rather than baseline food, loss of scrape rights for a week, demotion in the rotation, or being assigned the scouring job without the associated reward. Because the residue was small but rich, sanctions carried symbolic weight. Control over the last bite signalled control over the whole rationing system. Markets and technology altered the menu of scrapings. Urban households with access to more frying, cheaper oil, fish days produced crisp bits more often. Rural homes relied on boiled scrapings. Where iron pans were scarce and earthen pots common, scrapings were softer, more easily dissolved back into the pot and less suited to eating straight. That favoured the return to pot option and narrowed personal rights to bread and bake scrapings. Conversely, households with a small roasting jack or access to a communal bake oven on feast days saw more drippings and crust shards, raising the value of rights temporarily. Evidence survives in small ways. Household ordinances in service contracts sometimes promised good scrapings or dripping sops to apprentices on specified days. Court records show disputes when servants accused masters of withholding contracted extras. Parish cook accounts note the disposition of sediment in charity kettles, officially returned to the pot for fairness, but commonly used to favour settled parish poor over strangers when ladles thinned. In guild kitchens, posted rules forbade servants from taking scrapings before distribution, underscoring their recognised value. Health and hygiene concerns were practical. Managers skimmed burnt residue to avoid bitterness and stomach upset. Scrape rights did not mean char. The classic method was to sluice a little hot water, work the ring with a spatula, and judge by smell and colour. Good scrapings were glossy, not black. For children with weak teeth or illness, the scrapings were mashed into a sop to ease swallowing and digestion, allowing the child to benefit from concentration without chewing hard bits. Most households treated scrape rights as part of the day's closing ritual. After the main eating, after the pot was thinned for evening collations, the cook declared the right and handed a small plate or mug to the designated person. That timing kept the visible hierarchy intact and reduced public rivalry at the first serving. It also allowed managers to correct for earlier shortfalls. A child who had worked long or shown patience might receive a slightly larger right. One who already had an extra cup earlier might receive a token portion. In sum, scrape rights were a micro-institution built from heat, cookware, and scarcity. They captured calories that might otherwise be lost, converted cleaning into cooperation, and gave managers a fine-grained tool to reward, punish, or protect without reopening the argument over slices. Like the order of stirring and serving, the rule about who owned the browned bits decided small but meaningful differences in strength at day's end, especially for those who spent most days on the thin side of the ladle. Scrape rights mattered because residue held fat, exactly what kitchens of scarcity lacked. In most peasant and many urban homes, calories arrived largely as starch. Flavour and density came from the rare additions of animal fat, or in oil-using regions, cheap plant oils. Butter, lard, dripping, soot, and occasional oil determined whether a ladle filled a belly or merely warmed it. Because fats were costly, perishable, and regulated by the church calendar, their appearance often signalled a special day. Supply was seasonal. Late winter was the milk trough. Cows freshened only when grass returned. That meant less butter precisely during the hungry gap. As spring advanced, milk rose and butter-making resumed, but Lent frequently intervened. Where Lenten rules barred dairy, households either sold butter, stored it salted, or diverted it to wealthier buyers and institutions. Regions with oil traditions, Mediterranean olive, northern hemp or linseed, coped better on fish days. Inland communities without affordable oil endured leaner pots. Even outside Lent, small households rarely had enough surplus milk to churn more than a pat or two per week. Most cooking fat came not from churns but from pigs, lard rendered after autumn slaughter, and drippings recovered from any joint that passed through the kitchen. Storage shaped use. Butter kept in salt or submerged in brine inside earthenware crocks, firkins in later records, acquired strong flavours and was spent carefully. Dabs for festival breads, a finish for pottage on treat days, or a smear to seal a child's sop. Lard kept longer and fried better. Managers saved it for tasks that returned the most sensation per spoon, crisping oatcakes, sealing pasties, or enriching feast eve dishes. Drippings from a roast were collected in a dedicated pot, cooled, and spread thinly over several days of gruels and sops. Suet, firm fat from cattle or sheep, went into puddings and dumplings in later periods, but even in medieval settings it could thicken a pot on cold days when meat was otherwise absent. The church calendar governed legality and habit. Meatless days and Lent curtailed animal fats for many households. Better-off kitchens substituted oil, poorer ones accepted flatness, or leaned on mustard, vinegar, herbs, and onions for interest. In parts of the Low Countries and German lands, episcopal permissions, butter letters, allowed dairy on fast days for a fee, a policy that filtered social difference directly onto plates. In France, indulgence revenues even funded butter towers in some cathedrals, another sign that fasting rules and butter intersected publicly as well as privately. Where dispensations were granted for heavy labourers or the sick, a household might slip fat into one bowl while keeping the rest of the table compliant, reinforcing the usual worker-first bias. Markets added a second filter. Butter and lard fetched higher prices in towns, so smallholders near roads or market centres often sold fat rather than eat it, then bought cheaper bulk, peas, oats to feed the family. That arithmetic made sense for cash, but kept home pots thin. Conversely, gifts in fat had outsized value. A godparent sending a lump of butter after a christening, a neighbour sharing hot dripping at Martinmas, or a master granting dripping sops to an apprentice on a named day. These were remembered as favours long after a loaf was forgotten. Distribution at the table followed the familiar hierarchy. When fat appeared, first ladles for field hands drew from the lower, richer stratum. Children tasted fat most reliably via sops, crusts dipped in dripping, a spoon skimmed from the top of the pot, or the pan scrapings awarded by rotation. Managers used fat as both nutrition and management tool, small targeted additions to lift ailing children, posset with a drop of butter or oil where permitted, or to reward steady chore performance without cutting into primary slices. Because fat could be invisible once stirred in, It lent itself to private corrections that did not disturb the public order. Festive exceptions punctuated the year. Weddings, church dedications and major feasts brought richer pastry, white breads glossed with fat, fish fried in oil on abstinence days, and pottages finished with butter where rules allowed. Even wakes might include a special broth brightened with drippings for the poor, briefly narrowing the gap between high and low tables. In guilds and monasteries, recipe cycles for fast and feast days created predictable peaks in fat use that spilled into urban lay practice. Almond milk sauces in Lent for those who could afford nuts, buttery pies at Christmas for those who could not. Health reasoning mirrored practice. Household common sense and humoral advice aligned in valuing fat as warming and strengthening, especially for the weak and in cold seasons. A manager might slip a teaspoon of drippings into a child's evening cup after fever, or stir a little butter into barley water once Lent ended. Quantities were tiny, but the effect on satiety and morale was noticeable. Fuel and technique also mattered. Frying oatcakes or fish used short, intense heat and returned clear reward in texture. Long boiling without fat risked flatness. Where wood was scarce, households reserved frying for moments that justified the cost. Feast eves, guest visits, or earned treats. That decision reinforced the sense that butter days were holidays, not routine. In some, fats were the lever that turned subsistence into celebration and thin survival into strength, if only briefly. Their scarcity, seasonality, price and regulation meant they entered the pot as events. Managers spent them where they altered outcomes most, on heavy work, on contract-bound youths, on the sick, and in small quiet ways on children who had spent most of the season on the thin side of the ladle. Next, we follow that lever into the marketplace. How price spikes, assize weights and fish Fridays reshaped buying lists, and why households so often chose one more peck of peas over a pat of butter when coins were few. When coins were scarce and households chose a peck of peas over a pat of butter, those choices were not gender neutral. Portions tracked not only current labour but projected value. Who would pull a plough, sign a hiring contract, inherit strips, or bring wages back through service? In many rural households and in urban ones shaped by the same assumptions, boys received more bread and thicker ladles because families imagined their futures as heavy work and public earning. The calories were an investment ticket, written in food. The logic had several layers. First, agrarian work mapped male in principle, even though women and girls joined hay, harvest and manure carting when needed. The plough team, ditching crews and long carting days were coded men's work. Households felt pressure to keep a growing boy on the trajectory toward that work, taller, stronger, hireable. A stunted son jeopardised future rent payments and the capacity to meet manorial labour dues or later cash rents. Food, then, became preparation for the day he stood at the hiring cross or took the inside position behind the oxen. Second, adolescent physiology and schedule seemed to validate the policy. Boys from about 12 to 18 were sent on the longest errands, watched stock on the farthest commons, and were first tested at day hire for reaping or threshing. Their days took them out of the house at meal times, so households wrapped travel rations for them, bread and cheese when available, or a slab of cold pottage gelled in a dish, before smaller children ate. Because those rations were visible and portable, they hardened into priority slices. By the time the younger ones reached the table, the loaf was already shorter. Apprenticeship and service contracts reinforced the tilt. A bound boy moved quickly from child to worker in ration logic. Bread weights and meat days were specified in agreements, and masters could be challenged for underfeeding. Inside the natal home, parents anticipating binding a son sought to keep him tall and strong enough to command better terms. Again, a reason to protect his slice during the hungry gap. Daughters, by contrast, often entered service too, but in roles seen as lighter, dairy, cleaning, child-minding, with fewer explicit ration clauses. Their feed at home drifted closer to children's bowls unless they were already doing regular field days. Dowry and inheritance calculations pulled in the same direction. A son expected to inherit part of the holding or to farm separately needed muscle and stature to manage animals and tools. A daughter's contribution, framed as dowry or service wages saved toward marriage, did not seem to require extra calories now, particularly in the hungry gap when every increment taken by one mouth came from another. Managers converted a girl's present spinning output into cash or flour, but not necessarily into larger visible portions. The boy's potential for plough work looked like a more urgent claim on the day's thick ladle. Schooling and church messages underwrote the distinctions. Petty school hours were short. Boys who attended often still ran long errands or joined field tasks, justifying the travel slice. Sermons praised diligence and household order, rarely challenging the assumption that feeding strength first was prudent. Manuals aimed at householders emphasized thrift, obedience, and provision for one's calling, a term applied more readily to male breadwinning than to female domestic production. Within that moral economy, the extra heel in a boy's pouch read as responsible management, not favoritism. Evidence from institutional rations points to similar practice. Estate accounts listed reaper's bread and harvest allowances for men by task, with smaller or unspecified shares for women and children assisting. Hospital and guild distributions named workers' portions, again keyed to male-coded jobs. Even where women's labour was essential, turning hay, loading, gleaning, the paperwork framed it as supplementary and the food allowances followed suit. Households, seeing public norms, mirrored them at their own tables. The result was a steady pattern in hungry months. Boys collected calories both publicly, first slices, travel rations, and privately, scrape rights linked to distant tasks, while girls and younger children accumulated sips and invisible top-ups. Managers did adjust at the margins, thicker cups for a sick daughter, a sop for a toddler, but the baseline held. When fat appeared, it flowed first to the bowls destined for fields. When the assize shrank loaves, boys' rations were protected by habit and by the risk that a weakened adolescent would fail at hiring and reduce cash coming in. The policy's costs were long-term and largely borne by those outside the plough frame. Repeated late winter shorting of girls produced stunting that followed them into service, childbirth and disease seasons, because their work, spinning quotas, washing, fuel and water fetching, was classified as light. It did not trigger formal ration upgrades, even when hours were long and cold. The household met cash needs with the products of those tasks, while directing extra bread to the person whose future wage was imagined as higher. There were exceptions. In dairying districts during flush seasons, a capable dairymaid or a girl trusted with churning might receive larger portions tied to the value of butter or cheese produced. In some regions, women reaped with sickles as primary labourers, which drew reaper's bread regardless of gender. And households under stress sometimes inverted priorities briefly. If a daughter's spinning delivery determined whether the family received flour that week, her bowl thickened the night before the factor called. But these were tactical breaks. The strategic story remained boys first. The gendered ration map explains details that otherwise look arbitrary. Why travel slices were wrapped before anyone sat. Why a girl's extra work produced money for oil rather than meat on her trencher. Why scrape rights could be allocated to a returning goosekeeper, but not to the sister who met a spinning quota. It was a system that translated imagined futures, ploughs, contracts, inheritance into today's calories. If boys' portions were justified by imagined ploughs and hiring crosses, girls' portions were quietly subordinated to imagined dowries. In many households, a daughter's present calories were treated as a cost centre to be minimised so that cloth, linens, coins and small livestock could be assembled for her marriage. The arithmetic was straightforward and harsh. Every thicker ladle now threatened the fund that would make her placeable later. The dowry need not be large to govern meals. In peasant settings, it might be a cow, a pig, a chest, bedding, and a few coins. In towns, clothing, linen, and tools for a trade-minded husband, a journeyman's chest, a loom accessory. Even modest packages required long accumulation. Families earmarked earnings from girls' spinning, dairy tasks, poultry, gleaned grain, or petty sales, eggs, thread, to a small hoard, kept by the mother in a locked box or informally tracked in favours owed by kin. Each small success, sold hank, extra butter pat, good gleaning day, was counted toward the trousseau rather than toward richer dinners. This saving mentality depressed daily intake. Because girls' labour was classified as light or inside, upgrades to their rations were harder to justify within the public order of the table. A manager could thicken a daughter's cup in private, but visible slices still tracked the worker-first rule. When money arrived from a girl's output, households often converted it into durable goods, linen cloth, a blanket, rather than short-lived fats or meat. The logic was reputational and strategic. A chest and decent sheets improved marriage prospects in a way a week of richer pottage did not. Service reinforced the pattern. Many girls entered domestic service in their teens to make their portion. Wages, often a mix of cash, clothing and board, accumulated for 2 or 3 years and returned home at intervals or on contract completion. Until that move, however, the natal household treated the daughter as a savings pathway. She spun to quota for clothiers, minded younger siblings to free her mother for wage tasks, and managed poultry. The return was indirect, coins in the box, not meat on her trencher. When she did go into service, her rations improved under a master's contract, but the benefit accrued partly to the dowry chest rather than to her body in the years of growth that preceded it. Markets and seasonality sharpened choices. In the hungry gap, when assize loaves shrank and fats vanished, households clung to dowry plans as one of the few controllable futures. That meant preserving the cow earmarked for a daughter's marriage and selling butter rather than eating it, buying second-hand linen when a neighbour sold cheaply, and maintaining strict portions at table. After harvest, when food loosened, some of the dowry pressure eased. Daughters received extra at feast times, and small gifts from kin, caps, aprons, ribbons, padded the trousseau without cash outlay. But the structural preference remained, durable goods over daily calories. Institutions reflected and reinforced the model. Guild charity often targeted poor maidens' dowries, raising small sums to help place respectable girls in marriage. Parish bequests did the same, specifying distributions to maidens of good repute. These funds rarely supported food, they supported the chest. The message was clear. Community assistance would help equip a marriage, not fatten a girl in March. Households took their cue accordingly. Health consequences are visible in demographic patterns. Girls exposed to repeated late winter shortfalls showed stunting that complicated first pregnancies and increased vulnerability to spring fevers. Because their work remained constant, water, fuel, washing, spinning, the mismatch between effort and intake widened at precisely the ages when growth demanded more. Managers knew the risks and tried to offset illnesses with doctoring, warm ale, barley water, posets outside Lent, but these were episodic corrections inside a savings-first framework. Bargaining power at home and in courtship tied back to the dowry box. A better trousseau improved options and sometimes delayed marriage, allowing a girl to choose a more stable husband. That prospect could justify continued skimping. Parents argued, sometimes explicitly, that thin months now would prevent thin years later if a stronger dowry secured a competent tradesman or a slightly larger holding. In town, a dowry that included decent linen and clothing could attach a girl to a shop with steadier bread. In the countryside, a cow brought milk for future children and status in the yard. Daily hunger thus became the price of a stronger opening position in adult life. There were exceptions that loosened the pattern. In dairying districts during flush seasons, a skilled dairymaid might be fed more generously because her butter fetched good prices immediately. The household perceived a short feedback loop between her calories and cash. During harvests, where women reaped on equal terms, reapers' bread and ale allotments raised female intake temporarily. In some regions, godparents or employers pledged clothing or linens directly, easing the pressure on the natal home and allowing slightly fuller bowls. But these were situational breaks, not a redefinition of the rule. Discipline and reputation ran through the system. A daughter who appeared gluttonous threatened the family's standing. Thrift and modest appetite were folded into ideals of femininity. Mealtime behaviour, waiting, taking smaller slices without complaint, became a moral performance that confirmed marriageability. Managers used the language of honour to enforce rationing. A good girl saved for her house, meaning the household to come. In public spaces, the parish pot queue, guild kitchens, mothers kept daughters behind them, accepting portions for the family while signalling respectability and managing scrutiny. The ledger's final line explains the persistence. Dowries were one of the few assets households could build without land. They converted female labour into durable goods that shifted risk away from the natal hearth. To accumulate them under chronic scarcity, families trimmed daily calories first from those whose labour was undervalued in public rules. Daughters ate discipline and produced cash and cloth. When they married, the chest travelled, their childhood deficits stayed behind. Inside a rationing system tilted toward workers and dowries, siblings created a secondary market that softened edges without challenging the public rule. The currency was simple: crusts, sops, thick ladles, small beers and favours, and the exchange rate shifted with seasoned chores and parental attention. These trades rarely appeared in records, but they surface in service contracts disputes, in moral tales warning against stealing victuals, and in the practical hints embedded in housekeeping manuals. They were the micropolitics of hunger management. The most common bargain was liquid for solid. Younger children, who received more sips than slices, often swapped a promised evening cup of thin pottage for part of an older sibling's crust. The exchange made sense. The older child valued chew and portability for field tasks. The younger valued warmth and fullness at bedtime. Mothers tacitly tolerated such swaps when they preserved quiet and prevented open petitioning at table. A manager could even seed the market, hinting that the thickest scrapings would go to the one who surrendered at a half slice to the toddler, without changing the visible order of first and last. Chore-link trades came next. An older brother headed to the commons might hand over a bite of travel bread in exchange for a sister's promise to finish his distaff turns, or to stand in his place at the parish pot queue. In urban homes, a girl carrying thread to a factor could secure a loaned cap or ribbon for Sunday if she split her kitchen nibble with a sibling who took her sweeping turn. Because the household ledger rewarded completed tasks more than equal portions, siblings learned to trade time and labour for food, aligning with the manager's goals while shifting minor calories laterally. Rotation of scrape rights invited bargaining. Where scrapings were assigned by day or chore, siblings negotiated swaps in advance. Your turn today for mine at the bake oven day next week. The value of a scrape varied with the pot. During Lent, vegetable fond was precious, while on meat days dripping residue drew higher bids. Such swaps were enforceable only by reputation. A child who renounced a promised trade risked exclusion from future deals, and if discovered, formal penalties from the manager, loss of scrape rights for a week. Informal enforcement kept the market stable. Feast fragments produced spikes in negotiation. A sliver of cheese from a godparent, a sugared bun from a guild ale, or a fried fish edge on a fast day fetched high prices in sibling economies, often an afternoon of errands, help with washing, or a week's worth of kindling duty. Parents looked the other way, provided the trading did not upset public decorum. In some homes, mothers orchestrated redistribution under the guise of sharing, allowing a favoured daughter to swap a festival crumb for a sibling's future, turns minding the baby. Another way dowry labour extracted food value without violating the queue. Illness prompted a sanctioned inversion. When a child was weak, siblings were expected to surrender bites without formal exchange. The manager framed it as charity within the house. But even here, quiet deals followed, a pledged repayment in scrapings after recovery, or a promise of the sick child's first turn at the almond milk pot when a donor's gift arrived in Lent. The moral language of care coexisted with the practical arithmetic of return. Fairness disputes surfaced around concealed trades. An older child who skimmed thick ladle from the pot before stirring, effectively stealing from the household, triggered discipline, not negotiation. Moral literature condemned greedy gulps and double portions, precisely because unauthorized extraction threatened the manager's ability to keep peace. By contrast, visible consent-based swaps among siblings helped managers by reducing direct petitions to adults. The line between tolerated barter and theft was procedural. Trade after serving, not during, from your own portion, not the pot, with agreements noticed, not hidden. Gender-affected leverage. Boys with travel slices and scrape-linked outdoor tasks held more negotiable assets. Girls with inside labour often traded service, spinning, mending, for small solids. Over time, this produced a pattern that mirrored broader structures. Boys ceded crumbs to secure help with chores they disliked. Girls ceded time to gain food they lacked. The deals could be humane, ensuring a younger sister ate something chewable, or exploitative, loading girls with extra work for marginal returns. Mothers intervened when bargains undermined essential tasks or strained health, voiding swaps and reassigning duties. Markets outside the door intersected with sibling exchange. A child returning from the alewife with yesterday's small beer might have been tipped a mouthful. A baker could hand a crumb to a polite messenger. These small windfalls enriched negotiators and fueled evening swaps. I'll share the tip if you take my turn at the well tomorrow. Reputation with shopkeepers thus translated into bargaining power at home, teaching children that public comportment could be monetized in crusts. Seasonality altered rates. In post-harvest months, when bread was more, fats appeared occasionally, the marginal value of a crust fell and trades moved toward tasks and privileges, borrowing a cloak for church front place by the hearth. In the hungry gap, the exchange rate inverted. A thumb's width of bread could command multiple chores or a week of scrape rights. Managers monitored the escalation. Where trades looked coercive, older siblings extracting disproportionate returns. The key holder reset rules, sometimes by declaring no swaps this week or by reconfiguring rotations. Entry into service changed the market abruptly. A newly bound apprentice or maid ate on the master's ration and lost daily bargaining with younger siblings, but might return with gifts, caps, ribbons, stale shop bread that re-entered the home economy as occasional windfalls. Farewell meals before service often included a token enlargement of the departing child's portion. Siblings sometimes negotiated future claims on the apprentice's occasional gifts. Your first market day roll for my spinning the week you leave. Documentation is indirect, but telling. Court cases over taking victuals often began as sibling quarrels turned public. Service contracts that promised dripping sops on Sundays show that employers recognised the morale value of tiny extras that in natal homes circulated through sibling deals. Parish officers' notes about order at the dole, children to stand behind adults, hint that unsanctioned grabbing had to be contained, strengthening the role of family-level negotiation over public scuffles. In the end, sibling negotiation did not upend the household hierarchy, it absorbed its shocks. Children learn to convert time, labour and reputation into small calories without confronting the first slice rule. Managers tolerated and sometimes steered these trades to keep peace and complete tasks. The losers were those with the least to trade, sickly, very young, or socially awkward children who depended more on maternal discretion than on market savvy. The winners, predictably, were those with portable solids and visible chores. The micro-market of sibling swaps had its macro version in the manor and city household, the Great Hall. Here, food distribution was a public diagram of rank. Seating, service routes and tableware told everyone who ate first what they ate and what remained for the rest. The pattern that kept children last at a cottage table reappeared as a tiered system of trenchers, messes and scraps. Lay out fixed priorities before any dish left the kitchen. A raised dais held the high table for the lord, lady and honoured guests. Below sat household officers, retainers and visiting freemen, arranged by status along boards set on trestles. Further off, near screens, doors to pantry and buttery, and the passage to kitchens, stood places for lesser servants, grooms and occasional dependents. The poor waited beyond the threshold or in an ormonry where distributions were made later. Position dictated speed. The dais received the first, hottest and richest servings. Each step away downgraded quality and certainty. Service was organised by offices that also signalled rank. The pantler managed bread, the butler drink, the sewer, server and carvers handled dishes, and kitchen staff moved platters along prescribed routes. Dishes arrived in course and were shared in messes, groups of 2 or 4 who ate from the same platter. High-status messes received more variety and better cuts. Those lower down received plainer joints or vegetable dishes, and in lean seasons, fewer courses altogether. Bread differed too, manchet fine white above, maslin or rye below. Trenchers, the thick round slabs of coarse bread used as plates, were both utensil and rationing tool. At the dais they caught rich gravies and fats. At lower tables they held thinner pottages or saltier joints. When the course ended, trenchers from upper tables were removed by servers and did not return to those diners. They entered the hall's second economy. Good practice sent used trenchers to the almoner for distribution to the poor at the gate or to lower domestic staff in the screen's passage. Fat-soaked trenchers were high-value calories. Competition for them was managed by rule, not by grabbing. Leftovers followed mapped channels. Large households recorded liveries, allocations of bread, ale, and kitchen commons to named servants. Portions from the high table that remained untouched might be reserved for next meals. Cut meats, end bits, and second-course dishes passed down a step or two. The almoner had claim on specific categories: bread, ends, trenchers, some pottage, and was expected to convert these into charity while maintaining order at the door. The system made generosity visible, but controlled. Nothing moved without a title, and those titles preserved the hierarchy even in alms. Timing amplified difference. High-table diners began as soon as the herald or usher signalled. Lower boards waited until platters completed a circuit, and servers returned with ladles for pottage. Cooling mattered. Fat congealed as it travelled, sauces broke, boiled fish dried. By the time dishes reached the far boards, a course could be a different meal in texture and taste. In busy seasons or during shortages, later tables saw substitutions, extra bread and ale in place of missing joints, or a reduced number of messes served from a pot stretched with water. Discipline regulated access. Hall rules forbade servants from eating before service was complete. Scullions and turnspits were fed at set times and places, often on scraps and trenchers specifically assigned to the kitchen. Unauthorised taking, for ale, pre-mate, or pocketing portions mid-service drew fines or whipping because it disrupted both display and rationing. The spectacle of order mattered. Visitors judged a household's competence by smooth service and by the almoner's controlled distributions afterward. Fasts and feasts reshaped content but not structure. On fish days and in Lent, courses replaced flesh with fish, pulse dishes and oil-based sauces, yet the day still received the best cuts and most variety. Fresh fish in river towns, better sauces where almonds or spices were affordable. For the poor, alms on these days often meant fish bones, peas pottage, or trencher bread soaked in broth, useful but not abundant. On major feasts, volume expanded and trickle-down improved. More trenchers, more leftovers, larger alms. Still, rank decided sequence. The poor ate after the hall had displayed its sufficiency. Records show the accounting behind the theatre. Household ordinances specify bread tallies by board, ale by gallon to each rank, and meat by weight to messes. Almoners' rolls list numbers of trenchers and loaves given at the gate, with notes on festival spikes. City companies kept similar books. Liveries to members, then to poor brethren, then to passers-by. In each case, the ledger captured a structured flow from rich plate to poor hand. Children of the household sat inside this structure according to status. Hares might sit at a side table close to the dais and receive early servings. Younger children and wards sat lower and later, learning etiquette and rank along with diet. Pages and young apprentices working in the hall fared better than scullions in the kitchen. The former ate from mess platters after superiors, the latter from designated scraps or a pot kept aside for staff. The same logic that once gave a boy a travel slice and a girl a thin cup reappeared. Visible roles tied to future rank pulled food forward. Charity formalised scraps for others without erasing inequality. The poor at the gate received what the structure produced: trenchers, ends, thin broths, on a schedule, not on demand. The almoner's presence prevented fights, but also filtered recipients by residency or reputation. On big obit days, lines lengthened and portions grew, yet the order of entitlement, household first, dependents second, outsiders last, held. What looked like waste to a hungry eye was usually a planned transfer. Trenchers soaked with rich sauce were not discarded. They were income for the almoner's list or subsistence for servants. But because the movement was delayed and mediated by office, those furthest from the das bore the risk. Arriving late, holding a cracked bowl, or standing at the back of the alms queue meant less, even on a day of plenty. Thus, the great hall made visible what the cottage hid: food as a ranked pathway. Trenchers for some, scraps for others, with offices, ledgers and thresholds enforcing the sequence. The long tables ended at the screen's passage, but rationing continued at the doors that fed the hall: pantry, buttery and kitchen. These thresholds worked like valves. They controlled when bread, drink, and hot food crossed from store to stomach, and they sorted people by entitlement. If the dais staged abundance, the doorways enforced scarcity. Quietly, on a schedule, with ledgers and locks. Each office had a keeper and a hatch. The pantler issued bread from a locked pantry. Loaves were counted out by board and by livery allowance for servants. The butler dispensed ale through the buttery hatch, measuring by tankard or gallon to messes listed in his book. The clerk of the kitchen or his deputy passed dishes from the hot side at set calls. Servants and dependents who were not seated in the hall queued here, at the back step or screen, waiting for their turn when service for ranked diners had finished. Children of the household, unless they were high-born heirs learning etiquette, stood with the lower staff or were fed in side rooms after the hall had cleared. Locks and tallies replaced appetite as arbiters. Bread chests in the pantry were double-keyed. The pantler's tally matched the steward's count from morning issue. A scullion could not ask for one more loaf because the lads are hungry. He needed a note or the bell that signalled end of service, when trenchers and ends might be released for staff commons. The butler's cock's taps were pegged between courses. Drawing ale off schedule was 4 ale and fined. Hot dishes were physically blocked by doors and screens. Only named servers carried them out, and they returned platters before the next issue. In short, the architecture, hatches, screens, bolts, turned policy into wood and iron. Timing kept lower mouths waiting. First came high table, then upper boards, then lesser boards. Only after trenchers were lifted and dishes tallied did the kitchen issue staff meals. On busy days, the intervals stretched. Gravy cooled, pottage skinned, fat congealed. For those at the back step, the same dish meant a different meal by texture and temperature. If scarcity bit, the steward might declare commons short, bread and ale only, no kitchen meat until the next market day. Children attached to the household, pages aside, ate on the staff schedule, learning the rule that rank reached the hatch before age did. The doorkeepers also filtered the poor. The almoner's right to collect trenchers did not mean open access to the kitchen. Begging at the hatch was prohibited. Recipients waited at a side door or gate where the almoner or beadle handed out portions against a list or token. A mother with children might be recognised and served predictably. An unknown child was turned toward the almonry queue. This separation preserved order inside and kept the kitchen's stocks under the steward's eye. Within the servant body, doors reproduced rank. Officers, usher, cook's mate, pantler's boy received fixed liveries, so many loaves per day, measured ale, apart from the general commons. Lesser staff, turnspits, scullions, stable boys, relied more on what returned from the hall and on the end-of-service pottage. Apprentices in the household offices ate better than stable hands, but worse than the carvers. A youth's place in line taught him where he stood in the ladder he hoped to climb. Rules about removal were strict. Food issued for the hall could not be pocketed or diverted before service. Staff meals were to be eaten in designated spaces, not carried to lodgings where pilfered additions might be hidden. Fines for conveying victuals show up in household ordinances. Children and young servants were frequent offenders, taking a heel for a friend, a ladle for a sibling standing outside. Punishments targeted access, not survival, loss of livery for a day, demotion in the L queue, extra turns at the spit. The message was that the hatch decided fairness, not private sympathy. Urban houses and inns followed similar patterns. Great merchants' kitchens issued commons after guests were served. Apprentices took bread and ale at listed hours, with meat days specified in indentures. Inns guarded their kitchen doors fiercely. Staff ate from staff pots, while paying travellers drew from a separate issue. Children running errands for neighbouring families waited at side doors with jugs for small beer. The butler watered their fill or refused them if the hour was wrong. The built environment, a high sill, a narrow serving slit, a door that opened inward, made refusal easy. Fast and feast days altered content, but not control. In Lent, the buttery issued weaker ale and the kitchen more pulse dishes. Staff still waited for the ring of the service bell. On feast days, there was more to pass down, but the hatch sequence held. Only when a donor funded poor men's portions to be served hot did the kitchen open directly to outsiders, and even then under the almoner's supervision and for a fixed time. Documentation ties these practices together. Household books list pantry keys, buttery measures, and hours of issues. Ordinances require screens closed during carving, hatches shut between courses, and all staff present at commons bell. City companies set livery scales for apprentices and fines for drawing ale off hours. Hospital rules place pauper queues at a side gate, never at the kitchen door. The consistency across records suggests that door management was a core technology of rationing. For children, the lesson at the back step was the same as at the cottage table, only louder. Entitlement flowed through offices and hours, not hunger. A boy might carry trenchers to the pantry and be allowed a crust by favour, but he learned not to ask while the hatch was shut. A girl sent with a jug learned that politeness to the butler sometimes earned a top-off, but only after the bell. The barrier was not only wood, it was schedule, list, and rank. Thus, the kitchen doors translated the hall's visible hierarchy into daily practice. They protected stores, staged service, and rationed leftovers. Servants and children waited there, learning the timings and tokens that governed access. The same doors that rationed ordinary days also managed display. On feast days, weddings, and visits from superiors, the household staged abundance in the hall, even when ledgers were thin. The result was a controlled illusion: spectacle upstairs, austerity downstairs. Understanding how it worked explains why large visible joints and ornate subtleties did not guarantee fuller bowls for servants, dependents, or children waiting at the hatch. Planning began weeks ahead with credit. Stewards negotiated purchases on account: beef, capons, fish, spices, sugar, promising payment after rents came in or cloth was sold. Bakers and brewers increased output under the same expectation. The stewards' books show the balancing act. Set-piece items to impress: swans or peacocks in elite houses, whole salmon or large pies in middling homes, paired with cheaper bulk to fill platters, pottage, pulse dishes, trenchers and ale. The priority was image under scrutiny. Neighbours, tenants and potential creditors watched whether courses arrived on time, whether carvers and sewers performed correctly, and whether the almoner distributed leftovers in orderly fashion. A smooth show signalled solvency and good governance. Kitchen technique amplified appearance over substance. Whole birds were trussed and glazed to look large. Standing pies used thick crusts and forcemeats to occupy volume. Subtleties of paste and painted sugar announced themes without feeding many. Broths were clarified and coloured, then ladled in small cups to upper boards. Meanwhile, bulk pottages simmered for lower tables. The same carcass could furnish a grand presentation piece and very little usable meat for later distribution. Drippings, gravies and skins impressed above. Bone and gristle travelled down. Service choreography further insulated the show. Courses for the dais moved first and fastest. Carvers displayed skill with ritual cuts that maximised visible slices and minimised waste on the platter. Messes below received trimmed portions already losing heat. By the time platters reached the end boards, servers were under time pressure to clear for the next course, encouraging smaller scoops and quicker removals. The kitchen then reported platters returned to the steward, securing the count for accountability rather than maximising extraction for staff meals. Downstairs, staff commons were adjusted to protect the image. On heavy display days, cooks set aside a separate staff pot early, a thin but predictable meal, precisely to avoid dipping into show platters mid-service. After the last course, the clerk tallied leftovers and authorised limited release: trenchers for the almoner, bones and lesser cuts for the scullery, some pies and meats for officers' tables. Where accounts ran tight, the steward reserved choice remains for secondary entertainments: the morrow's guest, a visiting official, not for general staff. The result was that more food passed through the kitchen without increasing ordinary portions below. Almsgiving reinforced the illusion. The poor at the gate received more trenchers and visibility on feast days, which supported the household's reputation. But even increased alms did not necessarily improve nutrition for those inside. The almoner's first duty was outward distribution. Staff relied on their fixed liveries and the staff pot. Children attached to the household or visiting kin saw the procession and tasted occasional sweets or crusts, yet their main meal followed the same schedule and quality as on ordinary days. Costs of spectacle reappeared immediately after. Credit had to be settled. To pay for show ingredients, households cut purchases in the following weeks. Fewer meat days, weaker ale, more pulse. Stewards instructed the pantler to reduce bread issues to assize minimums. The butler watered small beer more heavily. Kitchens returned to cabbage and oats. Staff felt the tightening first. Apprentices and lower servants lost meat days before officers did. Children waiting at the hatch experienced the downturn as longer intervals and thinner cups. Records capture the pattern. Household ordinances spell out feast fare versus commons, with quantities for display lists and reduced scales for staff afterward. Guild and company books show quarter feasts with lavish bills for sugar and spices, followed by notes authorising smaller allowances until next dues arrived. In manorial accounts, extraordinary purchases for a lord's visit appear alongside directives to draw down stores in the weeks after. The balance of spectacle and austerity was not accidental. It was policy to protect credit and reputation. Architecture helped sustain the illusion. Screens, hatches and buttery rails separated onlookers from platters, preventing casual pilfering that could undermine the appearance of abundance in the hall. The distance from the dais to the kitchen lengthened the time before leftovers reached staff, increasing cooling and shrinkage. In some houses, a separate banqueting room for dessert removed the most refined and calorically dense items, marchpane, spiced wine from any trickle-down path. Fast and feast calendars provided cover. On fish days, frying in oil produced dramatic sights and smells with modest protein. On flesh days, one roasted showpiece overshadowed a day largely built on pulse and bread. During Lent, elaborate almond milk sauces and coloured jellies conveyed expense and piety while conserving meat stocks. In all cases, display satisfied the expectations of rank and ritual without fundamentally altering the ration map below. For managers in the lower offices, the goal was stability. They kept the staff pot steady, defended livery rights, and resisted informal requests during service. Their success preserved order and the illusion at the cost of better meals for those furthest from the dice. For children, the lesson matched the one at the cottage table and the kitchen door. Public abundance was not a cue to claim. Access still ran through offices, hours, and lists. Thus, banquet illusions were a rational response to a world where food was currency for status and credit. The hall displayed liquidity in dishes. The steward paid for it with weeks of thrift. Upstairs, spectacle. Downstairs, austerity. When the guests left and kitchens returned to peas and thinned ale, households still faced a recurring cost centre that ignored calendars: sickness. A feverish child, a coughing servant, or an exhausted mother after lambing forced managers to reallocate fuel, fat, and time. Sick day food, broths, possets, barley waters, looked simple, but was expensive once labour, fuel and foregone tasks were counted. Households treated these rations as targeted investments meant to shorten recovery, limit contagion, and restore a worker or dependent to baseline. Broth was the default because it scaled to means. In poor cottages, broth could mean water from long-cooked greens thickened with oats. In better-off homes, it was meat stock drawn from bones, shanks, or giblets. Even a bone broth cost fuel and planning. Bones had to be set aside from ordinary use, soaked or parboiled to remove salt if they came from cured meat, then simmered for hours. Cheap flavouring, onion, leek, parsley root, added digestibility. Managers served broth in small cups at intervals, not as a replacement for the main meal, to avoid provoking jealousy and to prevent the patient from vomiting a large portion. Barley water and grain waters served when fats were unavailable or forbidden, e.g. during Lent. Barley simmered until the liquor turned cloudy, produced a mild drink suited to fever and upset stomach. Oat gruels did the same with a little more body. These liquids required steady heat and clean vessels. Household practice kept a dedicated doctoring pot or pipkin to avoid taints from previous stews. The grain used was not trivial. A pint of barley diverted to water was a pint not available for thickening family pottage. Managers weighed the trade-off against the value of rehydrating a patient who could not keep solids. Possets sat at the costly end of the scale. A standard posset was hot ale or wine, curdled with milk or cream, then strained or left soft, sometimes sweetened with honey or spiced if a donor gift allowed. In dairy-scarce months or under Lenten rules, possets were replaced with warm ale sops, bread steeped in spiced ale, or oil-thickened broths. Each variant consumed assets: ale from the butts, milk from limited stock, honey from a neighbour's goodwill, and fuel for heating. Households therefore reserved possets for the weak, children, elders, postpartum women, or for turning points. In illness, when a child began to sip after days of refusal, or when a labourer needed a night's sleep to return to fields. Economics appeared in timing and secrecy. Managers avoided serving rich, sick food during public meals. They delivered cups before dawn, between services or after others slept. This prevented claims from healthy members and preserved the hierarchy. It also allowed ration precision. A half cup could be repeated hourly without advertising the total volume. When cash was tight, a neighbour's visit might be timed to coincide with brewing or baking to borrow heat for the posset, saving fuel. Fuel remained the silent price of care. Long simmers for broths competed with laundry and baking. On windy or wet days, wood burned faster. The doctoring fire could not be spared if posset curdled too quickly or broth failed to boil. Managers often scheduled sick cooking alongside tasks that already justified high heat. Wash day, bake day, soap boiling, then relied on reheating throughout the day. Reheating risked souring in warm spells. Clean ladles and quick cooling after service mattered. A soured pot set back a patient and wasted grain, amplifying the cost. Institutional relief existed but was narrow. Hospitals issued poor men's broth at gates. Guilds maintained sick boxes for members, sometimes including food allowances. Parish officers could authorise alms bread or a fish portion to families under visitation, recognised illness. Yet delivery schedules and eligibility rules meant that mothers still bore most logistical weight, fetching, preparing, feeding and cleaning. In urban settings, physicians and barber surgeons prescribed diets, light broths, barley water, diluted wine, but households translated prescriptions into affordable practice. Household medical reasoning was pragmatic. Even without formal humoral vocabulary, managers observed that warmth and moisture eased coughs, that strong flavours aggravated queasy stomachs, and that rich fats in small amounts improved sleep. They also tracked relapse risk. A child who sat up too soon after fever often returned to the pot thin and fractious. Managers paced the reintroduction of solids: broth, then sop, then a small slice, then thicker pottage. That schedule protected household order by preventing the spectacle of a patient receiving meat when workers did not. The opportunity cost of care showed up in chore lists. When a child was sick, an older sibling lost hours to minding. Water and fuel fetching doubled if vomiting required extra washing. The manager's own spinning or wage work fell off, affecting cash for oil or bread. To cover the gap, households drew on reciprocal ties. Neighbours sat a night, godparents sent a loaf or a little butter to enrich broth. These gifts were logged mentally and repaid later with labour or food, illustrating how sick rations were embedded in social credit. Sick servants exposed another layer of arithmetic. Ordinances often required masters to keep ailing apprentices with meat and lodging for a set time before returning them to kin or to hospital. The master's kitchen provided broth. The physician's fee, if any, and lost labour fell on the household. Masters therefore favoured early, cheap measures: warm bed space near a kitchen fire, broths over possets, and quick return to light duties. Youths who relapsed risked dismissal. Their natal homes resumed the cost of care, with fewer resources than the master's hall. Children's sick day rations overlapped with the sips not slices regime, but concentrated quality. Slightly richer cups, cleaner vessels, more frequent servings. Because thin children were vulnerable in the hungry gap, managers recognised that a few days of careful liquids could prevent a death that would bring both grief and labour loss. Still, the system could not escape scarcity. Families chose between a thicker cup for a patient and extra ladles for workers. They chose to sell a pat of butter to buy barley rather than to finish a posset. These decisions left traces in the ledger and in memory. Finally, recovery created a short window for catch-up feeding. Managers used scrape-rights, warmed sops, and discreet fat additions to lift a convalescent without changing public slices. A child who kept 2 days of broth might receive a third day sop with drippings or a little honey if available. If work demanded the window closed quickly, convalescents returned to chores with only marginal caloric improvement, risking renewed illness. Sick day rations, then, were less about recipes than about allocation under constraint. Broths, barley waters, and possets operated as instruments for managing risk, of death, of prolonged incapacity, of household disorder. They consumed fuel, time, and scarce fat precisely when the ledger was thinnest. The same kitchen that measured broths by the cup was also asked to underwrite therapies that removed food on purpose. Late medieval and early modern medical practice, at household, clerical and professional levels, leaned on regimens that cut intake, fasts, expelled contents, purges and emetics, drew blood, phlebotomy, or induced sweat. Each was thought to rebalance humours and shorten illness. Each also consumed scarce fuel, time and ingredients while reducing net calories just when patients needed them. Households weighed doctrine and advice against the risk that healing would deepen hunger. Therapeutic fasting overlapped with religious practice, but was distinct in intent and schedule. Physicians and learned regimina recommended abstinence at the onset of fevers, poxes, or agues. Thin barley waters, possets without solids, and avoidance of meat and fat. The aim was to cool, unburden digestion. Parish fast days reinforced restraint, so compliance was high. For adults, a day or two of light intake might reduce vomiting and allow sleep. For children and postpartum women, the same regimen could tip into weakness. Managers often complied publicly, serving only liquids at table, while privately adding an extra spoon of meal to the patient's cup, or shortening the fast once the worst symptoms passed. The visible fast protected reputation, the hidden modification protected the body. Purges and emetics cost both calories and commodities. Apothecaries supplied electuaries, often honey-based, syrup of roses, senna, rhubarb in later periods, or compound pills. Humbler homes used stronger beer with salt, wormwood infusions, or large draughts of warm water. After a purge, physicians prescribed thin gruels and avoidance of solid bread for a day. The procedure consumed honey or spices if available, fuel to heat infusions, and then a day of low intake during recovery. In bad years, families substituted simple laxatives, prunes if accessible, bran water to lessen cost, but the calorie deficit remained. A purged child might miss 2 days of real food at a time when a few solid meals would have sped convalescence. Bloodletting, when ordered by a physician or chosen by a household following almanac good days, removed more than blood, it removed appetite security. After venesection at the ankle or arm, standard advice limited heavy food and drink for a period and urged rest. The procedure might be cheap if a barber surgeon was already in the village. The aftercare was not. Broths had to be prepared. Labour had to be reallocated because the patient could not fetch water or fuel. If the worker bled was a wage earner, the day's income disappeared while the kitchen provided special cups. Children were sometimes bled for nosebleeds, headaches or fullness, exposing them to the same recovery diet despite smaller reserves. Many mothers quietly resisted bleeding the young in the hungry gap, invoking weather or the wrong sign of the moon as a socially acceptable delay. Sweating cures required heat and fluids, both costly. Patients were wrapped by the fire, set near heated stones or placed behind a screen. Possets or hot waters were administered to drive out illness. Fuel burned fast. The attendant, often an older child, lost work hours. The patient then needed salt and modest food to stabilise. In Lent, or during price spikes, households struggled to supply the necessary hot drinks and still feed workers. The visible outcome, copious sweat, satisfied therapeutic expectations, but the ledger showed wood and ale consumed with little left for ordinary bowls. Strengthening regimens prescribed after depletion also strained budgets. Physicians recommended chicken broth, soft eggs where allowed, white bread sops, or almond milk preparations for the weak. Even if doctrine banned meat and dairy on certain days, almond milk required almonds, chicken broth required a chicken, or at least bones. Many homes substituted barley water, pea broth sieved fine, or cabbage water thickened with oats. The form met the prescription, the substance did not. Patients improved slowly, and longer recovery meant more days of special cups and lost labour. Institutions modelled the same economics. Hospital diets posted for fever, flux, or wounds show sequences of abstinence, gruels, then broths, with meat days restored late. These houses purchased fuel and had staff, so the regimen was sustainable. Households copied the pattern without the institutional pantry. Guild sick funds sometimes issued broth tickets or small cash. Parishes provided alms bread. Still, the family kitchen bore the daily cost. Household managers adapted. They shortened medical fasts when symptoms eased, timed purges to market days to borrow heat from communal ovens, spread one posset across 2 servings, diluted apothecary syrups, and replaced bloodletting with topical measures, cupping, leeches in later periods, perceived as less draining, though these too required aftercare. They sequenced return to solids, broth, sop, slice, to minimise relapse and public friction. When funds were scarce, they invoked dispensations for labourers or the sick to reintroduce fats earlier, arguing compliance with spirit, if not letter. Children bore the sharpest trade-offs. Therapeutic abstinence during growth compounded seasonal deficits. Purges induced by strong beer or bitter herbs caused vomiting that set back hydration gains from thin potages. Mothers therefore leaned on barley wort and very small frequent cups, even if a practitioner urged stricter fasting. Compliance performed piety and prudence. Quiet modification kept a child from sliding into the empty spoon spiral. The arithmetic of cures that cost calories explains many small choices that otherwise look inconsistent. A household paying for a purge but then serving sops sooner than prescribed. A mother boiling barley water all day but refusing a second bleeding. A steward approving hospital broth for a servant but cutting his meat days afterward to recover cost. Care consumed the very resources scarcity made precious. The cumulative effect of cures that cost calories, thin household rations, and seasonal scarcity shows up most clearly in child outcomes. In many medieval and early modern settings, growth faltering began in late winter and early spring and recurred annually. The pattern produced short adult stature relative to potential, periodic outbreaks of deficiency disease, and elevated child mortality at specific points in the year. Households recognised the risks in practical terms, weakness, late walking, frequent fevers, but operated within a food economy that limited sustained correction. Stunting followed a predictable spiral. Children entered the hungry gap after months of adequate but monotonous autumn and early winter food. As stores dwindled and fast rules restricted fats and animal protein, rations shifted toward diluted cereals and greens. In homes where earned bites tied solids to chores, the smallest or sickest children failed to meet task thresholds and received fewer extras just when needs were highest. Therapeutic fasting for spring fevers compounded the deficit. Even when recovery began, the household returned patients to ordinary portions quickly to protect the work schedule. The result was a slow burn. Weight and height gains lagged each year, especially among girls whose portions were trimmed to protect dowry savings. Micronutrient shortages layered on top of calorie gaps. Vitamin C deficiency scurvy appeared in late winter where preserved fruits and fresh greens were scarce. Its signs, swollen, bleeding gums, joint pain, poor wound healing, were recorded in later periods more explicitly but likely present earlier. Households partially mitigated risk with early herbs, sorrel, nettles and onions or leeks. In coastal or river regions, fish and pickled foods supplied some nutrients. Still, when Lenten food rules and price spikes coincided, fresh sources were thin. Children who refused coarse greens or could not chew onions well during teething phases missed the few available sea sources and slid toward bleeding and lethargy. Iron deficiency manifested as pallor and fatigue, especially in adolescent girls balancing menstruation, spinning quotas, and limited access to meat. Humoral advice sometimes labelled this green sickness, prescribing rest and richer foods that households could not always supply. Managers addressed symptoms with warm drinks and modest fat additions, but without sustained iron sources, meat, legumes, properly cooked and plentiful, performance in chores dropped, further reducing earned portions in a feedback loop. Protein shortfalls were chronic in inland poor households, moderated only by pulses when fuel allowed long cooking. In the hungry gap, peas pottage often thinned to flavoured water. For toddlers transitioning from weaning, this was a critical hazard. Insufficient protein slowed growth and immune function, just as exposure to pathogens increased with warmer weather and more time outdoors. Managers tried to time thicker ladles for the youngest, but competition from working adults and fuel constraints kept these efforts irregular. Morbidity data, where it survives in parish burial registers and hospital notes from later medieval and early modern towns, shows seasonal spikes. Deaths from ague, flux and fever rose in late winter and early spring, then again in late summer with gastrointestinal disease. Children bore a disproportionate share. Medical regimens, purges, fasting, intended to treat these conditions often extended the period of low intake, delaying recovery. A child who lost 2 weeks of solid food and returned to chores too soon risked relapse, setting the stage for a second dip before new produce arrived. Dental development and weaning practices also intersected with malnutrition. Long swaddling and delayed introduction of chewable foods, combined with coarse bread crusts as the primary solid, created a mismatch. Children either gummed tough crusts without much extraction or relied on sops that delivered calories but little micronutrient diversity. During Lenten periods without dairy, the lack of animal fats further limited absorbable vitamins. Possets and soft eggs, where permitted or dispensed, were reserved for the very ill. Ordinary toddlers received diluted pottage multiple times a day. Gendered allocation mattered. Boys heading towards service or plough work received protected travel slices and thicker stews which buffered growth dips. Girls' contributions, spinning, washing, childcare, rarely triggered formal ration upgrades. Across repeated hungry gaps, the difference translated into shorter adult female stature and poorer obstetric outcomes later, reinforcing a cycle of maternal depletion and infant vulnerability. Deployed practical protections within these limits. Early greens were prioritised for the smallest. Barley waters and oat gruels were scheduled to maintain hydration during fevers. Managers kept a doctoring pot cleaner than ordinary cookware to reduce gastrointestinal infections. Reciprocal ties, godparents' loaves, neighbours' broth, were mobilised during illness to add short bursts of quality. Charity timing, Lenten loaves, parish pots, offered predictable supplements that mothers earmarked for children outside public meals. These measures reduced acute crises, but did not erase chronic undernutrition. Environmental and storage hazards widened the margin of failure. Mould and damp in grain stores increased as spring advanced. Ergot in rye during bad years caused convulsions and miscarriages, with children particularly sensitive. Rats and insects reduced usable grain, forcing greater reliance on oats and greens. In towns, adulteration and light as loaves cut effective calories per coin. Where water quality was poor, families leaned harder on small beer. When malt was short, even this buffer weakened. Institutions sometimes improved outcomes temporarily. Hospitals and foundling homes posted diets that, while lean, were regular and supervised. Orphans could receive measured bread and broth on schedule. Apprentices bound to reputable masters ate better than they had at home. Yet these benefits were contingent on access and reputation. Failures moved children back into households with the same structural constraints. The long-term picture is a population adapted to scarcity through behaviour, not biology. Disciplined portioning, seasonal coping strategies, and social credit to bridge gaps. For children, the adaptation meant recurrent energy deficits and sporadic micronutrient intake across critical growth windows. Measurable consequences: short stature, delayed adolescence for some, vulnerability to infection followed. Families saw the results in practical terms. A child who could not keep up with herding, a daughter who tired at the wheel, a boy refused at hiring for lack of size. Recognising the slow burn clarifies earlier chapters. Why managers guarded bread chests, why sips not slices stabilised days, why scrape rights mattered, and why care regimens that removed calories were controversial in practice even when endorsed in principle. When illness or price spikes reordered the household ledger, one dependable buffer remained: what small hands could pull from lanes, greens and hedges. Children were the natural foragers. They moved faster than adults between strips and commons, knew which ditches held watercress after a thaw, and could reach low berries without trampling crops. Foraging tied directly to rationing. The day's basket determined whether the evening pot thickened or merely coloured hot water. Season set the syllabus. In late winter and the first hungry weeks of spring, kitchens relied on new shoots. Nettles, Urtica dioica, were prime, picked with cloth-wrapped hands, tops only before flowering. Blanched and chopped, they bulked pottage and supplied greens when gardens were bare. Sorrel, Rumex acetosa, added sourness to thin broths. Chickweed, goosefoot and ground elder went in by handfuls. Ramsons, wild garlic, were prized in wooded districts. A few leaves lifted a cabbage pot without costly salt or onion. Children learned quick identifications from mothers and older siblings. Smell for ramsons, sting for nettle, ribbed sour taste for sorrel. Accurate sorting mattered. Mixing in too much bitter dock or tough older nettles ruined a pot that had to last the day. Spring also brought watercress in clean streams. Here, supervision and local knowledge were crucial. Households avoided sluggish ditches and mill races fouled by livestock. Cress was eaten same day. Managers stirred it into bowls after ladling to preserve bite. Early hare's lettuce, prickly sow thistle and baby dandelion leaves filled the same role. In many parishes, gleaning bylaws addressed greens only loosely, so children gathered freely on verges and in uncropped corners without formal penalties. Summer widened the field to berries and soft greens. Haws, hawthorn were still green, but blackberries and bilberries entered the diet where hedges and heaths allowed. Children carried reed or willow baskets lined with leaves. Crushed fruit stained hands and made pilfering obvious, a useful enforcement tool for mothers managing fairness at home. Fruit rarely replaced bread. It flavoured thin pottage or was stewed briefly to calm stomachs. Urban families foraged on waste ground and along town walls. Craft ordinances sometimes warned against children stripping fruit from private gardens, a reminder that access depended on local tolerance. Autumn was the main chance. Haws reddened and could be mashed and pushed through a coarse sieve to remove stones. The pulp thickened broths or sweetened an ale sop slightly when honey was absent. Rose hips, were used later for syrups, were mostly eaten as rough pulp in our period. Some households dried hips by the hearth to crumble into winter pots. Slow's blackthorn were tart. Without much sugar, they flavoured ale or vinegar rather than served as food. Hazelnuts were the real prize. A pocket of nuts meant protein and fat that travelled well. Children cracked a few at the hedge and carried the rest home for roasting or pounding into a coarse paste for feast eve pottages. Beech mast fed pigs more than people, but hungry households parched a pan for a scant snack. Acorns were last resort food, leached repeatedly in water to remove bitterness, dried and ground into a filler meal. The fuel and time cost made acorns an emergency measure, explained to children as famine work rather than regular cooking. Ownership and law framed what could be taken. Gleaning after harvest, collecting dropped ears, was regulated by manor or parish. Entry only after the lord's carts left, no rakes, children often first admitted. Hedges were usually common for berries but not for cutting. Hedge boat, right to wood, did not include stripping fruit trees in a close. In woodland jurisdictions, forest law restricted nutting in some seasons. Churchyards were sensitive grounds. Some wardens tolerated berry picking at the walls, others fined parents for trespass. Children learned invisible borders. Which ditch belonged to whom, which verge was everybody's, and how far from a cottage door was safe to gather. Processing habits were simple but strict. Greens were washed quickly in running water. Managers avoided long soaks that leached what little flavour and nutrients the leaves carried. Nettles were blanched first to kill the sting. Any tough stems went to hens. Berries were triaged, sound fruit to the pot, bruised fruit to immediate eating, leaky handfuls to the pig bucket. Nuts were dried near, not over, the fire to avoid rancidity. Dried greens, especially nettles, were crumbled into winter pottage in pinch quantities, a practice children helped with by rubbing leaves in cloth bags. Safety rules were taught early and repeated. Children were warned off hemlock and water drop wort near streams. Households that lacked fine botanical knowledge simply banned white umbels unless an adult gathered them. Mushrooms were largely avoided by the poor or taken only as the kinds we always take under adult supervision. Roadside verges near heavily used tracks were discouraged for cress and greens because of filth. A wrong basket could mean a sick child and lost labour the next day, too costly to risk. Foraging integrated with the household economy of rewards. A full nettle apron might earn scrape rights, a basket of hazels, a thicker evening ladle. Managers tied greens to collations. A child who returned shivering received a warmed cup as policy, not charity. The microeconomy was explicit. 2 hands of nettles for 1 spoon thicker. aligning child effort with the day's most elastic rationing tool. In spring, when charity loaves were light, a good forage day could offset the assize shrinkage in practical terms. Markets intersected with hedgerows. Towns saw petty sales of berries and nuts. Mothers sometimes allowed older children to sell a small surplus for coin to buy oil or salt, inputs that improved the whole pot more than the fruit would have. In years of dearth, officials restricted such petty trade to curb price gouging, pushing produce back into home use. Guild and hospital kitchens occasionally accepted donated greens, which parish officers counted toward a donor's reputation for Lenten charity. Foraging also trained root knowledge. Children mapped water sources, shelter from wind, and the timing of ripeness, which hawthorn ripened earliest, which bank held cress after frost, which hazel stand escaped pigs. That knowledge often passed to service. A maid who knew where to fetch clean cress near a town could improve her employer's table and her standing. Back at the natal home, the same knowledge made the child a net contributor in March. In sum, hedgerow harvests were not romantic add-ons, but operational inputs. They lifted thin pots at minimal cash cost, diversified vitamins in months when deficiency threatened, and gave managers a flexible reward system that didn't break the public order of slices. The constraints, fuel for blanching, legal access, sorting time were real, but the return justified sending small hands out each day the weather allowed. Foraging taught children that small advantages compounded. Bread bargaining taught them to find those advantages indoors. In households where slices were measured and the pot was stretched, children learned social tactics that nudged rations without breaching rules. The techniques were visible across cottages and urban rooms alike: respect to the key holder, awareness of serving rhythms, and subtle control over where a bowl landed on the board. Compliments to cooks functioned as a low-cost investment. The person with the knife and ladle, usually the mother or senior woman, managed scarcity and bore the burden of complaints. Praise reduced friction and, at the margin, won consideration later in the day. Manuals and moral tales urged children to thank those that prepare, not only as piety but as discipline. Household practice shows the payoff. A child who delivered greens clean and on time, stood ready with the right bowl, and refrained from public petitioning, positioned themselves for small private corrections. The thicker scrape dissolved into an evening cup, the better heel saved back after others left the bench, or a travel nibble tucked into a sleeve before a cold errand. None of this contravened the workers' first rule. It recognised the manager's discretionary space between the letter of rationing and the day's realities. Timing the ladle mattered because consistency governed pots. In most homes, the first servings set aside for workers were drawn from the lower, thicker layer. Then water or hot liquor was added along the side, the pot stirred, and subsequent bowls filled thinner. By watching the sequence, older children learned when a second or third pass would yield a relatively denser ladle, often just before the pot was topped up or just after scraping in residue from the sides. They also learned the day's cutting hour, when bread was sliced, and the small windows when the manager was busy with other tasks. A request then, "May I carry the bowls?" placed the child physically near the pot at the moment when a ladle could be fractionally deeper without public notice. In towns, similar rhythms governed bakery purchases. Arriving early avoided stale, assize minimum loaves. Arriving just before closing sometimes secured a discounted, heavier remnant. Children sent on these errands were told to return with the shop's stamp visible. Reliable timing improved both household weight and the child's standing as a messenger. Strategic seating exploited heat loss and reach. The board closest to the hearth or to the serving place received bowls hottest and least diluted. The far end cooled faster and tolerated more thinning. Families did not reseat to advantage every meal. Order itself preserved peace, but within a fixed arrangement, small shifts mattered. Sitting adjacent to the person who cut slices, rather than opposite, increased the chance of receiving a heel rather than a middle piece, and heels sopped more broth. At a crowded bench, guarding elbow room made spills less likely. A spilled bowl could not be replaced on a thin day. In service households, apprentices learned to stand where trenchers from higher tables would pass first to the pantry. A quick, permitted taste of gravy on a used trencher before it went to arms might be the day's only fat. Children also read utensils' signals. A heavier earthenware bowl retained heat and thickness. A thin wooden noggin cooled quickly and encouraged slow sipping. When the manager called for bowls, producing the heavier vessel at the right moment could mean a denser serving before the pot was watered. Likewise, knowing which spoon was in favour with the ladler mattered. Some spoons were deeper, others were the children's spoons. A child who cleaned and presented the good spoon predictably found it used for their serving when discretion allowed. Deference reduced wasteful conflict that managers punished. Open requests for more at table invited public refusals. The same child quiet during the meal might find a sop dipped for them afterward. Household ledgers show this logic indirectly. Managers avoided breaking rule in sight of others because precedent provoked claims. Children adapted by framing requests as offers of service, carrying water, fetching fuel, watching an infant, tasks that aligned with the manager's needs and justified a later top-up without visible favouritism. Bargaining extended to thresholds. At the parish pot, arriving early prevented dilution late in service. Presenting a sound bowl reduced losses on the walk home. At the buttery hatch, a polite child with a measured jug was more likely to receive a full small beer draw than one with a cracked vessel. Children learned which beadles checked tokens strictly and which allowed a brief top-off for known families. These micro-practices combined manners and timing to capture ounces that became meaningful across weeks. Risk management underlay every tactic. A child who reached for the pot before the first serving risked sanction, loss of scrape rights or exclusion from future errands. The safe zone for bargaining sat after priority rations were secured and before the pot was thinned again, or outside the public meal altogether. Managers signalled openness. A set-aside cup on the hearth, a remark about good nettles today, or an instruction to keep the bigger bowl by for someone returning chilled. Children who learned these cues reduced their own volatility without challenging policy. Markets added a final layer. In towns, children were used to read the stall. Which baker weighed fair that week? Which alewife's small beer soured slower? Reporting back accurately earned trust and, with it, discretion at the ladle. In villages, knowing when the mill ran drier or when a neighbour slaughtered a pig allowed households to time purchases or exchanges, which translated into slightly thicker pots for a day or two. Children's eyes and feet made that possible. Their reward came as marginal gains. Half fingers of bread, slightly richer cups, delivered through the same hands they had helped. Put simply, bread bargaining did not replace scarcity. It organised behaviour around it. Compliments preserved the manager's authority and opened channels for private help. Timing captured the denser moments in a predictable sequence. Seating and utensils managed heat and probability. For children who had little claim on first slices, these tactics translated observation and manners into calories at the margin, the only space the system consistently offered them. The same observation and timing that won extra crusts at home extended into lanes, yards and shop fronts. Children operated in a neighbourhood snack economy where small foods moved along lines of kinship, godparent ties, work relations and credit. These bites did not replace rations. They filled gaps, stabilised mood, and, when predictable, allowed mothers to trim the evening pot without open conflict. Godparents were the strongest conduit. In many parishes, godparenthood implied periodic gifts beyond the baptismal day, white rolls at feast times, a slice of cheese after a gild ale, or a sweetened bun when the godparents' household baked. Timing was conventional, Sundays after Mass, patron saint days and the week after a successful hiring or sale. Mothers sent the godchild with a clean cloth and message. The return was public enough to signal the tie, but modest enough not to provoke envy. In tight years, gifts shifted from coin to food. A small roll was easier to spare than money. Children learned to present themselves properly, cap straight, polite address, because godparent generosity was discretionary and reputation-based. Gossips, female friends linked through shared baptisms and neighbourhood support, formed the next layer. They traded nibbles tied to labour, a cup of warm small beer after laundry, a heel of bread while watching a toddler, a taste of stew when one pot ran richer than another. These exchanges were reciprocal and recorded mentally. A woman known to share a hot cup with a neighbour's child on cold evenings could expect help with carrying water or sitting up with the sick. Children acted as couriers. They carried bowls between houses, delivered thanks and returned vessels promptly to protect the tie. Shop fronts and stalls offered another channel. Bakers commonly had end pieces, overbaked loaves or day-old stock. Regular customers' children might receive a small broken crust when returning a stamped loaf board or paying on time. Alewives sometimes topped off a child's jug or gave a sip to a known errand runner, particularly if the house settled its score weekly. Butchers' boys, when trimming, passed a scrap of suet or gristle to a child who kept out from underfoot, useful for frying oatcakes at home. The expectation was manners and speed. Return change accurately, show the shop's token or tally, and step aside when paying customers crowded in. Informal regulation shaped access. Towns and manors disliked open street begging by children. Beadles tolerated known families' children receiving small shopfront bites. Unknown children were chased away. Ordinances occasionally forbade giving food at the bakehouse door during shortages to prevent crowds. Vendors were told to channel charity through parish officers or the almoner. As a result, snack flows were local and personal rather than public and general. Children learned where a quiet nod worked and where a Beadles patrol would intervene. Events created temporary surpluses. After guild feasts, quarter-day dinners, weddings or funerals, leftovers moved through kitchens to doors. Stewards prioritised dependents and poor lists, but some food leaked as thank yous to regular helpers. Stable lads, scullery girls, message runners. Children positioned themselves at known exit points, the yard gate, the screens passage, to receive permitted pieces. Mothers coached them, wait until the steward signals, keep the bowl covered, bring it straight home. A child who performed well on such days earned future errands and, with them, future bites. Risk and stigma coexisted with benefit. Taking food outside prescribed channels, lifting from trays, crowding a stall, returning twice in new clothing, brought public rebukes that damaged a family's credit with shopkeepers. Repeated cadging could appear in vestry notes and cost access to parish doles. Families therefore distinguished between legitimate snack economy, reciprocity, godparental obligation, service tips, and disapproved begging. Children were trained to use phrases that framed bites as courtesies. My mother sends thanks for yesterday's loan. The jug for small beer as on Fridays. Not have you food? Season shaped what circulated. In spring, greens were shared cooked, not raw. Neighbours lent heat in bowls more than solids. In summer, berries and soft fruit passed child to child with instructions to eat immediately. Autumn saw nuts pooled for shared roasting. A neighbour with a working oven might host a pan for several families in exchange for a portion. Winter bites skewed to warm liquids and bakehouse ends. Lenten snack patterns substituted fish scraps and oil-fried odds where available. Almond milk confections were rare and reserved for higher status gifts. Credit and cash interacted with food. A trustworthy child messenger allowed a household to buy on short credit, smoothing weeks when cash lagged the clothier's payment. In return, the shop offered small courtesies, better weight at the assize minimum, a remnant pie crust placed aside. Conversely, a household in arrears saw these courtesies vanish. Children reported back that the baker weighed strictly and the alewife refused top-offs. Mothers adjusted, more reliance on parish pots, more emphasis on hedgerow foraging, and stricter bread bargaining at home. Institutions provided structured nibbles at edges. Hospitals sometimes issued gate broth at set hours. Children could carry a small measure home if a patient relative was admitted. Guild almshouses maintained bread days for listed widows. Their children received predictably, but could not bring friends. These programs reduced volatility for some families and narrowed the role of ad hoc shopfront generosity. Finally, snack economy knowledge became a child's skill with future value. A girl who knew which stalls were fair, which hours yielded day-old bargains, and how to keep good standing with an alewife carried that competence into service. A boy who cultivated favour with the pantler's lad might later secure an apprenticeship in a household office. At home, the same skills translated into steadier evening bowls when the ledger was thinnest. Taken together, neighbours and nibbles provided a mesh of small supports, none decisive alone, but cumulatively important. They rewarded punctuality, manners and accurate errands, and they penalised disorder. For managers, predictable snack inflows justified shaving a ladle at supper without provoking complaint. For children, they were a route to agency inside a rationing regime. We've come a long way together, through hungry gaps and parish pots, breadboards and buttery hatches, tiny hands in the hedgerow and tired ones at the ladle. If there's a single thread running through it all, it's this. Families did the best they could with what they had. And children's well-being depended on quiet systems, predictable cups, fair turns, small reserves, kind neighbours, more than on grand moments. Today we can do better on purpose. Steady meals instead of earned bites, simple buffers instead of spectacles, and rules that put growing bodies first. Keep the pot on, keep the schedule kind, and let fairness be something children can feel without asking. Wherever you're reading from tonight, city flat, farmhouse kitchen, dorm bunk, I hope the room is warm, the blankets are friendly, and your own perpetual pot, whatever that looks like, is simmering gently in the background. Sleep well, and good night.